calling the City Council special meeting of Thursday, March 14th, 2019. It is 6:30 p.m. And Madam Clerk, would you please call roll?
Mayor Christy Malchow.
Present.
Deputy Mayor Karen Moran.
Present.
Councilmember Tom Hornish.
Here.
Councilmember Jason Ritchie.
Here.
Councilmember Chris Ross.
Present.
Councilmember Pamela Stewart. Here. Councilmember Ramiro Valderrama.
Present.
We have a quorum. Councilmember Ritchie, would you please lead us in the pledge?
I would be honored. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, next we have approval of agenda. And it has been brought to my attention that we need to switch something on the agenda. We need to switch.
Yes, Madam Deputy Mayor, we have two items tonight. They both are in the same general topic, but we have them in reverse order. We have the ordinance which extends the interim development regulations, and then we have the ordinance relating to the permanent regulations, and we need to put those in reverse order and deal with the interim regulations first.
That makes perfect sense to me. So, entertain a motion.
I make a motion that we reverse the order of items 1 and 2 on the agenda, with the ordinance extending development regulations first, followed by the ordinance relating to development regulations regarding design of short plats and so on.
Second.
Second.
Okay, there is a first and a second. Any discussion?
I have a question.
Okay.
And the question I have is, I guess it's still not clear to me why we wouldn't have the order to discuss the items first before we discuss if we're going to extend. Here it sounds like we will make the decision on the extend and then look at those circumstances. So I guess I'm trying to understand why isn't in the minds of staff in reverse order.
I believe there's going to be a presentation, Ramiro.
Yes, I believe there's going to be a presentation with those.
Yes, there will be. Mr. Thomas is going to walk you through both of these items.
Okay, and he'll make it clear to us, intuitively obvious why that is?
Yes, he will.
Thank you.
I'll just answer that right now because I'm not sure we were going to cover that in the presentation.
Okay. So
the interim regs will make a decision on to renew or not renew the interim regs first. If for whatever reason, when we get then to this, if we would have done things in the order they were on the agenda, you could have possibly taken action on the permanent regulations first and then on the interim regulations second. And we were advised by legal counsel just before the meeting here that in theory, the interim regs could end up displacing the permanent regs that you would have acted on first. So order of events, kind of like going back to addition, subtraction, multiplication in grade 2 math class. We got to do certain things first.
Deal with the interim first and then proceed to the permanent. Okay.
And then at some point, whether it's tonight or whether it's at some other date and time, if the council does act on permanent regulations, those will then displace the interim regs then.
Okay, so we're going to do what's in the brackets first. All right, thanks.
Interim regs first.
Yeah.
Right, any other discussion? All in favor then, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none. Moving on. Okay, so we are going for our first, well then it's going to be number 2. So our first public hearing tonight is going to be on extending interim development regulations regarding the design and construction of short plats and subdivisions authorized by the Growth Management Act as adopted by Ordinance 0218468 and as amended by ordinance number 0218471 for a period of 6 months, provided for severability and establishing an effective date of 0219482. Whatever that should be. Okay. And we will open the public hearing. And do we have anybody signed up?
So while our Commissioner Crandall is pulling that list, I'll maybe just make a quick introductory comment. So we hadn't intended necessarily on renewing these interim regs back in September when they were initially adopted. We had a schedule to move through the regular legislative review process within a timely 6-month window period of time. And unfortunately, February 11th ended up being one of our snow days where City Hall was closed, the council meeting was canceled, and the public hearing that you were going to have on the permanent regs was scheduled for that night. Because of our noticing procedures in code, minimum 30-day required notice, we had to move this into March, so we're here tonight. That will be the next item on your agenda is the public hearing for the permanent regs. The interim regs expire effectively Monday morning at 12:01. So to avoid any potential gap in having the interim regs in place before permanent regs are adopted, we wanted to bring this back to you to renew the interim regs. Hopefully not for very long, but as long as you need to give proper consideration and take action on the permanent regs. So with that, Deputy Mayor, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, we actually have a question.
Hey, Jeff.
Hi.
What happens, what are we legally permitted to do as far as extending the interim regs beyond Monday? Can we do that? Can we extend or keep our public hearing open? How does that work? If we chose to do that? If this conversation goes long, I mean, we're kind of up against a...
On the permanent regs or the interim regs?
We're talking about interim right now, right? So the interim regs expire Monday, right?
Correct.
So if the interim regs expire on Monday, and we haven't adopted the permanent regs tonight, can we will how does that work?
Well, what will happen is the codes in effect on Monday will revert back to the codes in place prior to September 18th of last year.
Okay. What would be the, can I follow on? Is there a process in place to maintain the current interim regs beyond Monday for whatever period is there a set time? Is there a maximum time, or have we already reached the maximum time?
Right.
While we're negotiating or developing the permanent set?
So that's the item before you right now for public hearing. And there were two options included in your agenda bill. One was to adopt the ordinance renewing the interim regs for a period of up to 6 months. That's the staff recommendation, given the situation that we're in with the snow day and the timeline's gotten dragged out here on the permanent regs. Your other option would be to not adopt the ordinance tonight. And then the interim regs would lapse Monday, and then you'd be back to September 18th regulations prior to that date. The one other thing I'll mention actually just really quick, because of the timing of tonight versus the expiration of the interim regs, if you do adopt this ordinance that's in front of you to renew the interim regs, we would be looking for a minimum 5 votes from the council so that it would be able to take effect on an emergency basis, as opposed to the ordinance taking effect 5 days after the clerk publishes it.
Which puts us past Monday.
Correct.
Understood. Thank you.
Okay, we only have one person who has signed on, Mr. Eastman. Welcome back into the country.
So if I understand right, this is the public comment portion of whether or not to extend the interim regs? Correct. And there's another public comment? Okay. James Eastman, 3636 East Lake Sammamish Parkway Northeast. On these regulations, and then I downloaded the extended YouTube version now where I can listen on my phone and download all these meetings. And it's become clear to me that we're trying to legislate ourselves out of every single problem that we have. And I think we're kind of painting ourselves into a corner. And we think we can solve character issues with these codes and development issues with these codes. And I think there's going to be unintended consequences. A lot of times I sit back and I say, oh man, what would this do to me? Oh, that would kill me there, or that would kill me there. why not have some leeway where I could save 1,000 trees here or connect the city stormwater there and maybe break this code or break that code. But by trying to legislate every single little thing, I think there's going to be unintended consequences. And it came up in David's discussion probably in Planning Commission meeting about doing just a holistic development review. Rather than trying to put everybody in a box, you could do a holistic development review and maybe, hey, that guy backs up against a hillside. You know what, we're going to let him go to 42 feet tall, which is a couple feet over the code, but in return, he's going to save that nice grove of couple hundred-year-old trees that screen him from the road, or this or that, or have some flexibility. And I know that it gets pretty gray, but it did say it would be possible, and it'd be a lot more work. And I think we're to the point in the city where we're so far built out, we're so worried about our character. Maybe it's time for that. We've lost a ton of planning staff. We have this moratorium on pretty much development anyways due to concurrency. Maybe we take, if this is going to be extended, maybe we take extra time and actually go to a code with a development review that's more holistic. I mean, are we in a hurry? I mean, is this a Hollywood trip for concurrency? Because if it is, I mean, we got some time. So maybe now's the time to kind of go to a more holistic code and, have our planners busy doing that. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who would like to address the council?
Hi, Karen Herring, 23684 Southeast 32nd Way. I just wish you would extend these interim regulations until, you decide. I don't understand the order here, but we need these regulations, and you need to really respect what your staff recommends. They work really hard for this city, for me, and for you. So I appreciate them. I hope you will as well. Thanks.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Mary Wichter. I live at 408 208th Avenue Northeast in Sammamish. And the thing I handed out will be split into two public hearings. I didn't think there would be two. Basically, I personally do not think that you should put a gap between the interim development ordinance and any of the permanent code. I think what you did is an emergency. I would say that the mass grading makes it as part of that. I do like the amount of work that's been done afterwards to amend it and with the permanent code. So I'm hoping that you'll extend the interim ordinance or renew them. And that gives you from tonight till 10 o'clock and also 6 months to be able to get the permanent. And I would like to see the permanent moved in sooner than later because there's some emergencies on that. And that's what I'll speak to in the next thing. But pretty much, I honestly believe that there's too much mass grading. You do too many trees. It affects stormwater too much. And I will wholeheartedly back what James Eastman said. We really do need to tie the stormwater code together, the urban forestry management plan together. You guys have been playing square, 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 and not playing chess or checkers for a long time. And you're going to have to start thinking about those things. And when the stormwater code amendments come up, they're going to talk about some of these. So I think starting with what you have with the revised permanent is good, and then you're going to have to bring those other things in. And I know stormwater code's already on the plan, and I know our esteemed David Pyle and Jeff Thomas had talked about the other things coming forward. I don't know if they'll make it in this year, but those do really need to happen because I think they complement each other. So that's my vote, is keep the interim regulations. I would like to see that clearing and grading and critical areas added to that, but if you're moving ahead with the permanent, if you're not going to move ahead with the permanent, I think the clearing and grading and critical areas, there's two items there. Those need to get added to the current ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who would like to address the council this evening? Seeing none. I'm going to close the hearing. And then I'd like to hear from staff a little bit about if there's any questions that we have from council. And I'm looking at my phone here only. I'm not reading messages. I'm trying to see if I have anything from anybody in.
I've got a question. I don't think I have your number, Karen.
Oh, okay. Just yell out, Tom.
All right. I'm looking through our interim regs. We passed one reg for the interim development reg, and we passed another interim resolution that kind of altered the initial interim development regs. And I'm trying to play out in my mind, Jeff. This is more for Jeff, I think, than anybody else. That kind of, or maybe I'm not sure who's there from legal. If we only get 4 votes tonight, I'm just going to put it out there, and it's not an emergency for the extension, and you have a 1-day gap on Monday, I think because the thing we passed that altered what it is applicable to says on or before September 18th, it had to be a pre-app that was completed with satisfaction. That even if we only get 4 votes, there would, even though you have a 1-day gap, there would be no possibility of reverting back to the code and have an application. Somebody could come in and make an application, but it's not complete, so they wouldn't be able to actually push forward on the old regs. Is that correct?
I'm not, Tom, this is Jeff. I'm not sure I completely caught the end of that, where you.
So let me try to say it again, because I was doing it on the fly here to try to figure it out. So going to the scenario, if there are only 4 votes and it's not an emergency, they expire and lapse on Monday. Let's take the scenario, somebody comes in with an application Tuesday morning. You take the application, it's not complete. There's nothing in the interim development regs that says that that's going to be exempt from the interim development regs. So even though the interim development regs are not extended and were lapsed into the old ones, that new application, because it's not complete, would still have to come, and then the interim development regs spring back to life on Tuesday morning because of the 5 days with only a 4-vote non-emergency. They would still have to comply with the interim development regs even if they come in Monday morning. Is that correct?
Under that scenario, yes, because the regulations that you would vest to would be from the date the application was determined to be complete.
Yeah. But remember, we did a carve-out that kind of changed that a little bit from the first interim development regs. I want to make sure that that carve-out that we did as an exemption, which was subsequent to the initial adoption of the interim development regs, do not allow that application Monday morning to get out of it.
The only scenario that may change, and I don't know if this helps any, but it is 5 days after it's published. So that publication would take place maybe Sunday at the earliest, and so you're looking at 5 days from that date. So you're going to have a little bit bigger window than what you may be thinking about there.
Well, that makes it even a little bit more concerning to me, but still, it's a similar issue that in that interim period, if it's not an emergency tonight, how do we ensure that the exemption that we applied on the second go-around in this process, and I'm going to go back up here on the first page to get to the actual ordinance. Actually, ordinance 2018-471, that we talked about pre-app meetings even more so than vesting for completed applications. I want to make sure that that does not apply to those applications next week before this becomes effective if it's not an emergency. Or if we need to, we can make it clear in this extension that they would not apply until they have a completed application. Therefore, no application next week would be able to meet the old regs without a completed application.
Councilmember Hornish, this is David Linehan. If the carve-out that you're referring to is part of the tweaks that were made to the interim regs, I think back in November, if the interim regs lapse, everything in it lapses, so the carve-out would lapse as well. So I think, if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think that would address your concern. That carve-out for pre-app meetings being scheduled and that sort of thing, that would also go away, and you would just be back to the regulations as they were in place prior to the adoption of the ordinance.
Okay, wait a minute. No, I don't think that's quite right, because they would, if it's not an emergency, but it springs forth 5 days after publication, as Larry said, then everything comes back.
Right. No, you're right about that. The interim regulations will lapse, and so everything that's in the interim regulations lapses until they become effective again. And so,
Thank you. So my question then is, under that that ordinance that I just mentioned, I can't even find it now, dang it. And remember, we did the carve out to kind of give a little more freedom for pre-app meetings that didn't have completed applications. But we said that the interim development regs would not apply. But if you can go with me to Section 1 of Ordinance 2018-471.
yes.
Section 1 with the underline, it says provided that these regs are inapplicable to the town center that had vested, and also to projects for which a pre-app meeting has been completed to the satisfaction on or before September 18th. So I'm trying to understand here on the fly that if that springs back and the September 18th date in there, even though somebody applies next week on March 19th, the September 18th would still pull it. They would never be able to go back to the old regs because it never had a completed application in 4 days of lapse or whatever, correct?
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, so I just wanted to make that clear in my mind. Sorry, that was a real kind of a puzzle for me. Okay, thank you.
Okay, next in queue, we have Councilmember Stewart and then Mayor Melchow.
I'd like to ask that we allow staff to go forward with the presentation and have all of this be part of that discussion, but I feel like we're having a discussion before we have any material to discuss, so that would be my request.
So I think on the interim regs, you've gotten the presentation from staff. The rest of the presentation we're going to make is related to the permanent regs. So this action here it's a go or no go, option 1 or option 2 that's in your agenda bill.
Then I'd like to make a motion that we extend the interim regulations. One question on that: do we automatically do it for up to 6 months, or do we can we or should we set a different timeline? Is it always just up to 6 months?
The ordinance is currently drafted to be a 6-month extension.
Right.
It doesn't have to be that. You could set a different amount, but the 6 months gives you the maximum flexibility for the timing of the permanent adoption.
Then I would like to move that we extend the interim regulations for up to 6 months as written.
Second.
We have a first and a second discussion. And I'm going to start this time with Mayor Melchow.
Thank you. I think my question got answered through Councilmember Hornish's question, but I wanted to find out, to make a completed application in the event that we only have 4 votes and there is a lapse, would you need an appointment in order to make a completed application?
Yes.
Okay, and then the likelihood of that occurring in that window sounds like it would probably be Monday through Friday we would have open. Is that right?
Playing the percentages with our ability to publish the ordinance, that would be just about correct.
Okay, so of the appointments that you've had, and that would then include those that were done prior to September 18th, how many of them would be ready to walk in with a completed application? I'm trying to assess the level of, I'm not sure how to phrase it, but I'm trying to figure out how many could walk in the door, essentially, if there's a gap.
So going back to Councilmember Hornish's original question, the language that was in Ordinance 471 speaks specifically to pre-application meetings that had taken place with the city to the satisfaction of the director on or before September 18th. There's another section of city code that is not in this ordinance, but was pre-existing language going back multiple years in time, that a pre-application meeting is actually only valid for a period of 6 months. So under this scenario, that section 1 clause that's in ordinance 471 that was being discussed by Councilmember Cornish and our city attorney. Yeah, there's no pre-app at this point, or as of Sunday, in theory, there's no pre-application meeting at this point that was successfully completed on or before September 18th that will still be valid because the code expires those out after 6 months.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Any more discussion? Not seeing any. I'm going to call for the vote.
I have a question. If you can hear me.
Oh, and you were so close. Okay. Councilmember Valderrama.
If I may request, Councilmember Valderrama, can you try to speak more directly into the phone? You're really hard to hear.
All right, I switched it off. Is this better?
A little bit.
Yep.
Okay. So the first question for staff is, I see you talk about September 18 was adopted as an emergency ordinance, and I'm trying to find on this resolution as drafted here, where it again comes in as emergency when we vote it in. So I know we can vote it in by the number, but I don't see emergency ordinance. Maybe I missed it in the document after the original September 18th mention of it.
Councilmember Valderrama, the ordinance drafted for tonight's consideration, the Section 6, the effective date, declares this ordinance to be part of a public emergency, and that the effective date would be immediately.
Okay, for some reason I see Section 4 on it. Let me see if I can go. All right, I don't see the Section 6. I see effective date Section 4, published in the official newspaper of the city and take effect in full force 5 days after date of publication. So maybe there's a different version that I'm looking at than the one that's online for the city. But that answers the question. The second issue, though, let's move on from that, assuming that I have a different version there. I am concerned that given what we've been told before, that it really is immaterial whether this is an emergency or not, because if it's adopted, it will continue in that the council has repeatedly said that they don't want to be ruling by emergency order. Between the two, and given that it won't have any material effect that people can get it in, I would suggest that we submit this as a regular ordinance.
I'd be happy to comment on that if you like.
Okay.
Please.
I don't think it was this city council's intent 6 months ago or 4 months ago or even 5 weeks ago to be in a situation of having to consider an emergency ordinance to avoid any sort of lapse in the interim regulations. Council gave staff clear direction in November when Ordinance 471 passed that it was interested in going through the regular rulemaking process in a fashion that would have the permanent regulations wrapped up before the expiration or the need to consider renewing or extending the interim regulations. Staff love or hate the regulations, staff worked very hard to work with our planning commission starting in December all the way through the month of January, to the extent the planning commission had an extra meeting in January to wrap their business up before planning commission terms expired and get their recommendations to the city council. And we were certainly on track to have this public hearing on February 11th. Unfortunately, Mother Nature intervened and put us in a little bit of an awkward position because of a somewhat archaic noticing requirement in our code to advertise public hearings for a minimum of 30 days before they occur with land use matters. So I think we've all been operating in good intent to not bring another emergency ordinance forward. And unfortunately, again, Mother Nature put us in a little bit of a precarious position that we're here tonight considering this on 96 hours before the the lapse of the interim regulations. So I think intent has been good, effort has been genuine, but we had a little bit of intervention that brings us here tonight to consider this.
All right, well, thank you. And for deliberation purposes, I just wanted to say that while I'm supportive of it going forward, I don't want it to go forward as an emergency ordinance. Thank you.
Any other discussion? Hearing none, I'm going to call for the vote. All in favor, say, well, raise your hands, we'll see half. All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay.
Nay.
Believe we have a 6-1 vote.
Back to number one.
And I do, personally, would like to thank the Planning Commission. I was able to take in some of those meetings, and they worked very hard and did a great job going through a lot of that information. It was they put in some very long meetings. And one of them had some great food, too, so that was awesome.
What?
Okay, so that takes us to our second hearing. So we're going to open the second hearing.
So a couple of introductory remarks, and then we actually do have a presentation for this one. So
Okay.
if the council would.
Pardon?
She opened the hearing,
Do what?
Presentation will be part of public hearing.
Are you asking whether we should have the public testimony first or the presentation first?
Yes.
Either one. Your choice.
I would like to have the staff presentation first.
So I'm going to turn the presentation part over to David here momentarily, but just a couple of quick introductory remarks on this. So we've already well vetted at this point that this is a reschedule from February 11th, the snow day. What we're looking for tonight from the council is pretty straightforward here. We're not asking you to bring this matter to a close tonight. What we're asking for is for you to complete the public hearing, open and close it. And then the Exhibit 4 that was in your packet materials was the City Council proposed code amendment tracker matrix. That's been updated through some Master Builder Association requests, as well as a couple of additional City Council member requests. We did email that to the council a couple hours ago now. We apologize for the late hour of that, but we will have it as part of our presentation here this evening. So what we'd like to do is complete the public hearing and then walk you through to get some direction from council on some of these amendment requests to see if you'd like us to spend any time working on these between now and early next week so we can bring this back to you on Tuesday for your deliberation. So no formal action required this evening on this. Complete the public hearing. Let's walk through these amendment matrices, and then we'll hopefully get some direction from you, and we'll go back to work and come back next week and see where we're at. So with that, I think you're ready. Yep. I'm going to turn it over to David at this point, and if you have questions along the way, please let us know.
Good evening, members of the council, Deputy Mayor Moran. So Jeff already covered a few of the things that are listed here in this presentation, so I'll gloss over those quickly when we get to those points. Thank you for joining us tonight to talk about have additional discussion on the proposed permanent development regulations. The objectives of this portion of tonight's meeting is to review the proposed development regulations, as Jeff pointed out, hold a public hearing, and then to provide direction to staff on the next steps. As Jeff pointed out, council last met on February 4th to review the Planning Commission recommendations. The proposed permanent updates, they're included as Exhibit 3A. So what we did was we took the Planning Commission's recommendation and the Planning Commission recommended draft and included it with the packet for tonight, and we'll be working off of that as a base. We've also included a matrix, as Jeff pointed out, to track proposed changes. It's the The topics are organized into 8 topical areas: density, rounding, setbacks, fences, building height, et cetera. The primary focus with the commission was operative code language, code concepts and outcomes. The secondary focus was the dimensional settings. If you recall from past conversations on this topic, writing code is kind of like is like setting a dial. Once you have the concepts in place, you can move a lever or you can turn a dial fairly easily to get a different outcome, so long as you have the right concepts in place in the code. Other changes were made related to code consistency. If you change a word in one place, you might have to change it throughout the code. So if you see several pages of code changes, it's not we're trying to change things, it's just you have to chase it through the whole code. The first one is density rounding. If you recall from the last meeting, we talked about rounding decimal points. So with this code change, we've proposed truncating the decimal point to 2 decimal points. And we've proposed that for long plats, those subdivisions of more than 10 units before rounding fractions, that you round up at 0.51, and that for short plats, those subdivisions of less than 9 units before rounding fractions, you would round up at 0.71. And what happens here is if you go through the density calculation and say you had 11.65 units, well, that's more than 10, so because you have 11, so that puts you in the more than 10 category. And then what happens is you look at the balance, the fraction that's left, and that tells you whether you're going to add another unit or not get any more. So in this case of 11.65, you would get 12. In the case of 11.41, you would get 11. And that works the same for the one below that. If you had less than 9 units through the basic density calculation, so 4.85 is one example, and you had more than 0.71 of a fraction, then you would get an additional unit. We also included at the Planning Commission's request a bonus for developments that might include a townhouse or a duplex. So if 25% of the total units in the development are townhomes or duplexes, then you would be able to round up at a decimal point of 0.21.
Councilmember Ritchie. Councilmember Stewart.
I may regret asking this question. It's not completely related to the code changes, but it just, so what happens if I have 9.72 is what my number comes to? So I know that means I'm going to go into the bucket where it's 9, but you're going to allow me to round up. That would put me in the 10-unit bucket. Does that mean that then from there on forward, I follow the long plat regulations through the rest of the code?
If you chose to take advantage of that unit, you would be put into the category of a long subdivision.
Okay, thank you.
The next topic area is setbacks. In this case, we changed the orientation of setbacks. So if you recall, historically the city has had a street setback and an interior setback. The street setback has been in place since the city's incorporation. The interior setback has been one that we have incrementally increased. So historically we had 5 feet as an interior setback. So that would have been the side and the rear of a property could have had 5 feet on each property line. Sometime back in 2016, we increased it to 5, 7, and 15, so that it would require a larger yard on one end of the yard where you would be applying the 15. What this does is it changes the system from a street and a interior to a front, a side, and a rear, which is more typical to other codes that we see in the region. It's also easier for us to determine how to apply those setbacks, and you might see more of a standardized layout in lots. And what we also did was we created 3 categories for setbacks, and this is one that the Planning Commission asked us to do, where we created a standard setback for all structures, which is a generic structure setback. Then we created a separate setback category for primary residences. And then finally, we created another setback area for detached accessory dwelling units. So those are found in the code, and the way that works is if you're building something like a trellis or a covered outdoor kitchen or a carport that's detached from the primary residence, then the generic setback would apply to that. If you were building a home, then the detached primary residence setback would apply. If you were proposing a detached accessory dwelling unit that met the city's requirements for detached accessory dwelling units, you would be then applying the detached accessory dwelling unit setback. We also added a method to allow for a reduction of setbacks when neighbors agree. So along one of the property lines, you might find that, say you wanted to do a bump out to your kitchen, or if you had a vacant existing lot, you might want to build a new home on that lot, and you might want to reduce a setback along the side or the rear. If you were in agreement with your neighbor, and if you worked with your neighbor, you might be able to obtain a reduction down to a minimum of 5 feet, so long as it does not conflict with other codes such as the building code or the city's stormwater manual. So what that would be is something that would be a contract between you and your neighbor. It would be recorded with King County records, and it would identify what the setback is that was negotiated basically between the property owners. And it would run with the land so that if one of the homes were to sell, it would have been recorded with the title and would run with the title of the property. We worked with our on-call planning consultant, AHBL, to put together some graphics that depict what you might see in terms of lot size and home size. So what they did was they went on to some of the builders in the community's website, Toll Brothers and Murray Franklin, and they found some floor plans of common homes that are built and sold in the city. One of the questions that we had is, or one of the statements that we had heard through public comment was that these setbacks are going to cause for a large lot to be required. You can see here what the lot sizes would be based on the home sizes, and I have several other graphics that I'll be showing you. So if you were proposing a new home in the R6 that was 2,400 square feet, using the Toll Brothers Sydney design, your lot size requirement would be 2,999 square feet, 95 square feet, excuse me. And these are rough numbers, realize, so they're not exact measurements, but these are pretty close using the tools that the consultant had to put these graphics together. So you can see here that if you were proposing on building a home smaller than 2,500 square feet, depending on the floor plan and the layout of the building, you could, the land requirement may not be that great. So as you step up the home size to the 2,500 to 4,000 range, and then above the 4,000 range, you can see that the land area requirement does go up corresponding to the home size. That was the Planning Commission's intent in recommending this. So you can see how that works. What the consultant did was they also added some other details here, so you can see what other types of amenities you might be able to include on those lots. The small lot with the smaller home, the 2,500 square foot home, there was not additional land available to really add things like a accessory shed or an accessory dwelling unit. However, on the larger lot, the 8,900 square foot lot with the 4,400 square foot home, you would be able to accommodate a detached accessory dwelling unit. So although there is a larger land requirement, there are additional items and amenities that could be included with those larger homes and larger lots. Just by way of example, the city of Sammamish does not have a minimum lot size, nor are we proposing to include a minimum lot size in the city's code as one of the zoning controls. Most of our neighboring jurisdictions have a minimum lot size that corresponds to the zone. So if you were to take a look at a chart, which we have, which we could provide you after this meeting if you'd like to see it, in the research that we did, we compared all of our adjacent and nearby jurisdictions to see what their minimum lot size requirements were by zone. So what that is if you were to propose a subdivision of land, you would be not only required to conform to the density requirements of that area, but you would also be required to design each of those lots to have a minimum amount of square footage. So in the case of R6, most neighboring jurisdictions require approximately 7,200 square feet. So you can see here that if you were to be building a smaller home, Sammamish would still be requiring, by way of its setbacks, a much smaller lot size than our neighboring jurisdictions do. Oftentimes in adjacent neighboring jurisdictions, the other zoning controls are what limits the amount of development that can occur, as opposed to Sammamish, where primarily it is the density calculation. So in another city, you might achieve, by density calculation, say 12 units after running your density calculation, but the minimum lot size requirement of that jurisdiction might, based on the geometry of your lot, only afford you, say, 11 units or 10 units, just because of the shape and size of the lots that are required. So there's a lot to consider here. I'll go on to the next one. This one shows the R4 district. So recall that the two footnotes, I think they are 23 and 24 in the draft code, include the variable setback based on home size. You can see here that in the less intense zone, the R4 zone, the setback is increased slightly. So the lot size requirements, the spatial requirements for different home sizes goes up. You're still in the less than 3,000 square foot range for a less than 2,500 square foot home. So depending on the size of the home that the builder is attempting to bring to market depends on the size of the lot that's required. They're directly related. So what this is, and what we had heard originally from the council is that there is interest in regulating large homes on small lots. And what this does is it regulates small homes on large homes on small lots. And what it does is it requires a lot size that corresponds to the home size. The next one is the R1 district, and this shows what a lot size might look like in the R1 district. Again, you can see that based on the different bracketed sizes, there are different spatial requirements. Now, the R1 does not have a variable setback. The R1 has a standard setback. So you can see here that the setbacks are all consistent, although you might have a larger home size. The larger home size would also require a larger lot just because the footprint of the home is bigger. Although there are much larger home sizes here, it's also important to note that in the R1 district, which is 1 dwelling unit per acre, an acre is 43,560 square feet. So most jurisdictions require approximately 32,000 square feet for a minimum lot size if you were to do a subdivision in the R1. In this case, we would be requiring, depending on the product that the builder was attempting to bring to market, these sizes here. You might see a lot size of 12,000 square feet for a almost 4,500 square foot home. So our lot sizes, again, are much smaller than our adjacent jurisdictions, although we do have other factors to consider in our code, such as open space requirements, such as critical areas deductions, such as roads, stormwater vaults, those types of things, so that we shouldn't discount those, although we do have a smaller lot size requirement by default by way of setbacks than our adjacent jurisdictions do. The next one is an example of what you might be able to achieve on an existing lot. So if you were to take a 9,400 square foot lot in the R4 district that was vacant, so say you owned a piece of land and you wanted to build a house on it. This shows what you might be able to achieve. You could achieve a 4,200 square foot home. You could achieve a detached accessory dwelling unit, a detached carport. All of these things could fit on that property within the bracketed variable setback requirements that are included, I believe, under footnote 23 and 24 in the code. The one to the right shows a corner lot and how that might work, utilizing the front yard and the rear and side yard system that we are proposing. And you can see here that with a 9,400 square foot lot, you would be able to get about a 4,400 square foot home, including, in addition to that, a detached accessory dwelling unit. So what this does is it helps to highlight the different setbacks that apply to different components of the property. The generic setback that would apply to any structure, such as a carport, the primary residence setback system that depends on the home size if you're in the R4 or the R6. And then it also shows how a detached accessory dwelling unit setback might work if you were wanting to build one of those on your property. The next one is example lot configurations on an existing lot in the R6 district. So this shows you what you might be able to achieve in the R6 zone. The expectation is that as the zone increases by number, R4 to R6, that the lot size you would see typically goes down because the R6 is a higher intensity zone. A higher intensity zone requires typically smaller lots. So with an 8,000 square foot lot, which is larger generally than the 7,200 square foot lot, minimum lot size that we see in other jurisdictions, the 8,000 square foot lot here would provide a 4,700 square foot home using a non-corner lot. With a corner lot scenario, you would be limited more so, and the home size would be more around 3,900 square feet. Again, this does not include other factors such as stormwater requirements that you might be required to place on site, tree retention. There's a whole host of things that builders, designers, homeowners are required to consider. And home design and property and how to use property efficiently is definitely a complex thing, something that we coach applicants through regularly. The next topic area is building height. What we did here was we changed the method of building height measurement from average existing grade to average finished grade. Excuse me, we changed it the opposite, average finished grade to average existing grade. So what we're proposing is that building height be measured from the existing topography prior to construction. We also added a limitation on facade height to 40 feet with a few specific exceptions. And we added an 18-foot height restriction for standalone detached accessory dwelling units. The next is mass grading. We added a prohibition on mass grading. We added a definition of mass grading. We added restrictions to qualify what is allowed and what is not allowed. Specifically, fill is limited to 5 feet and can be up to 8 feet. We defined what exceptional circumstances are. Excavation is limited to 10 feet. And we added exceptions for road construction and other necessary underground infrastructure or structures that don't change the surface elevation, such as a foundation. We also added a restriction prohibiting speculative clearing before construction permits are issued. What this does is it says that before you get a permit to clear the property, you're required to have all of your final engineering approved. Because we've actually had scenarios and other jurisdictions have had the same problem where someone is working through engineering, they clear the land, and then they realize that the project's a no-go and we're left with the scar on the landscape. So basically this is saying you can't clear until you're ready to actually go to construction. The next was fence heights. We added allowance for fence heights up to 8 feet, limited it to 32 feet in length. It required an agreement with an affected neighbor, and it requires a building permit. It also can't cause inconsistency with other adopted codes or standards. That is, you can't put up an 8-foot tall fence if it's in violation of, say, the fire separation requirements of the building code. So what that does is this allowance does not trump other safety considerations and other codes. Item number 6 is parking. We added a requirement that one additional parking space be provided for each new lot created through subdivision in the R4 and R6, so it doesn't apply to the R1 or the R8. We also added clarifying language where the parking must be located. On street in front of the house is the first. The second is, I believe it's on a private street or other area. I'd have to look at the code exactly. And the third is on an area that's managed by an HOA. So the idea here is that on balance, a neighborhood that's being created through subdivision provides adequate parking for overflow events, such as a birthday party, a Christmas celebration, those types of things. And we have heard comment from neighbors who live in old divisions next to a new division that when the new division has an event, one of the homeowners has an event, that their street and their front yards and their areas become flooded with cars from that new home because that new division has no parking signs, fire lane parked down both sides of the road. Item number 7 is street frontage. We added a requirement that new lots created through subdivision, R1, R4, and R6, be designed to include 30 feet of street frontage on a public or a private street. The commission also added flexibility, allowing averaging of street frontage across the project with a minimum of 20 feet and an average of 30. So if the geometry doesn't work for you to have 30 for each lot, you can reduce it down to 20, and maybe you increase it on some others to obtain the average requirement. The last of the items is a critical areas work permit. This is one that was proposed by one of the members of the audience, and the commission liked the idea. We carried it forward. We added it to the code. So we added a prohibition that work in critical areas, when allowed, first requires a clearing and grading permit. So as we wrapped up the Planning Commission meeting, the Planning Commission also made recommendations on some other things to consider with future work products. They suggested we consider a daylight plane on building envelope, a restriction on building height based on building segments, landscape requirements for setback areas that front arterial streets, restriction on grading around the perimeter of a site to better blend existing grade, and that there are other cleanup amendments such as grammar and other word choice. We did hear about some of the other code sections that we weren't proposing to amend from members of the audience. Similar to the public comments that we have tonight, some of these sections are not actually proposed to be amended, and there's some cleanup language that might be valuable to consider.
Thank you. Any questions? And I'm going to look at my phone here. Okay.
Sorry, I know.
It's okay. Councilmember Stewart.
So in terms of the additional considerations, are there any that staff feel we should consider now as opposed to waiting until later that would be important to make sure that the regulations we're considering are complete or clear?
Yeah, that's a good question. These are all going to require different degrees of research and analysis. So we're comfortable with moving forward with the completion of phase 1 of the code update. And certainly then we'll roll these into then our future work that we'll be continuing with the development regulations.
Thank you.
Okay, so do we have a sign-in sheet? Okay, we have one person down. Mr. Eastman. Come on down.
James Eastman, 36360 East Lake Sammamish Parkway Northeast. On these interim or new regs, I think they're okay. I don't think they're great, but I think they're much better than they were. Still a little unclear. I'm hoping that maybe we can take the time. I think some of the unintended consequences may be that, I don't know, someone may have a regular sized lot that probably could have a lot of dwelling units, but then they got to put a cul-de-sac in there. And then when they put a cul-de-sac in there, they might not be able to meet the side yard setbacks. So maybe they're just going to throw a few, really big houses in and call it good. Or maybe the alternative would be to do some duplexes or townhomes. And if we are going to go to the duplex or townhome route, I personally think our current code is somewhat unclear when it comes to that. It routes you into an LID code, it routes you into the town center code, and it's like, I can't even tell what you can do because it's taking you all these other places. So we could just clean that up and say, hey, if you can't do all this and you just want to impact a little bit of area and do some duplexes or townhomes, here's the code that you have to build to. Also, I started with the Planning Commission and I proposed an alternative ADU that I want to build on my own property. They liked it. I think you guys, I brought it to you twice and have liked it. I saw it on the last exhibit up there in your packet, but I'm not sure if it ever made its way in there. Basically what it says, if you just maintain a current setback for a house, then your ADU can go as high as your house goes because it's not going to your 5 feet setback. It's just going to maintain whatever your house setback is. I think that would be great. It's less impact, and it would be on, for me, it would be on, over an acre lot where there is no neighbors. I do think with the exhibits that were great that David had, I think you are going to see a lot of ADUs, and I think it's pretty unclear up there with your code, from 0 to 2,500 size home, you can have this setback. Well, does that 2,500 include that ADU that you're going to put in your backyard? Because really, now you're up to 3,500. Well, I think it's 1,000 square foot is so it's unclear right there. I think you might get some people that go to $39.99. Oh, I got an ADU in the backyard that's 1,000, but it's not part of that $39.99. So we'll call it an ADU and we'll just use it for an office or a theater or something, but we'll detach it. So I think you might get some unintended consequences there. But overall, I'm okay with this. I stand by my comments earlier where I think we should go to a more holistic code regardless. And thank you.
Is there anybody else who'd like to address the council?
Hello, my name's Mary Wichter, and I live at 408 208th Avenue Northeast in Sammamish. So back to the written thing that I'd handed out that I wasn't able to send in before 5. The emergency things that are needed, which is why I'd like you to adopt the permanent regulations as soon as possible, perhaps tonight, are that you have added a prohibition on work in critical areas when allowed without first obtaining a permit. You have to have it. That actually will meet the Department of Commerce intent in all of our neighboring areas because I believe it was just a code error that needed cleanup. David has also wisely added the restriction for prohibiting the speculative clearing. That does happen. Those lots get scalped and they sit there for a long time abandoned, and it's just horrible. So I agree with those with the mass grading, which is the other reason I'd like you to adopt, because I believe that permanent regulations, there were a lot of changes that they heard and they incorporated, and I think they're way better than the interim ones that you've renewed. So please consider that. So Councilmember Stewart asked, what can we do now? The two things I would like you to do now, it's really the same change, is just change the word 5 to 4 in 2 places, because the code actually says if you have fill in excess of 4 feet, it needs to be engineered. So if you cut or build, you can build a retaining wall 4 feet or less without a permit. But if it's 5 feet, you'll end up with a gap. You'll be, oh, well, I cut it 5 feet, but I don't need a permit at 4. So you'll have all these people playing with this 1 foot thing, and that's just not okay. 5 feet's pretty tall. I'm 5'7". So I really think it needs to be 4 instead of 5. So you are limiting it for fill, but you haven't done the same limit for excavation. So there's just 2 places. It's just changing the word to 4 instead of 5, and I think that will make the code more clear. So it doesn't change with any of the setbacks or anything. This is just the excavation and cuts. There is one math error where it says it's a 1 to 2 slope, which is a 50% slope, and it's from the old code. It says it's 66.7%. That's just an error. You could just delete those words. If you don't want to do it, I think if there's a conflict, the more restrictive one always applies. On fences, I really think, so I didn't bring in LeBron James tonight, but if you have 8 feet, so LeBron James is 6'8", and if you go up to 8 feet, you can also put him on a retaining wall of 4 feet, which means you can get to 10 feet or 12 feet. So they're really high. So I think first of all, that you need to understand that. And fences can screen things and provide privacy, but they also can make cubicles. And I really think that they should be one tool. So I think it's really important that eventually those fences need to get taken down if they're not needed or if they're not maintained or if there's vegetation up. The other thing is, and I think Ms. Moran will understand this, fences should not be allowed where easements exist. If you have a utility easement for access and safety, it should at least have removable panels or not be there at all. So I suggest adding, I got this from the Sammamish Plateau Water tech specs, any fence is a structure, and whether requiring a permit or not, easements prohibit locating structures over the easement, including but not limited to rockeries, concrete slabs, walls, fences, or trees. And you should also call 811 before you dig if you don't know what locate services are.
You know your audience well. Do we have anybody else who would like to address the council? Okay, we're going to close the public hearing. Yay. We have finished our job, Jeff. All right. Being that as it may, I believe we had, yes.
Can I have one thing?
We did. We have got a couple of questions. We have got queued up. We're going to start with Councilmember Ritchie, then we're going to go to Mayor Malchow.
So, Jeff, David, do you have what you need from the council as far as direction, as far as speaking with stakeholders, citizens, builders, whomever, as far as working through the remaining portions of the Phase 1 development regulations and then working with the same group or others into Phase 2? Do you need a motion from us, or do you have the direction that you need from us at this point?
Not quite. So that's part 2 of our presentation here tonight. So up on the screen, once we get done with your questions based on what you've heard this evening, plus any other questions that you would like to ask, what we'd like to do is, this is an updated version. What's on your screen right now is an updated version of Exhibit 4 from your packet materials. Essentially, the list has gotten longer than what was published in your packet materials at the end of last week.
And you don't have to read this version. We do have it focused in another version, so don't pull out your readers and try to.
This is just to show the totality here. So what we'd like to do after taking your questions is we'd like to, as David gave you a preview, we'd like to just walk through these fairly quickly one by one to get council direction on whether you want us to spend time developing code language for these items to bring back to you next week. So we do need that from you tonight. Assuming we make it that far tonight through this exercise, I believe we will have direction then to assemble final code amendments. Again, remember what's in your packet, the code that's in your packet attached to the ordinance is the code as recommended by the Planning Commission. We froze that in time so that we don't, for version control, so we don't get different versions going around. So what you would be considering, whether it's on Tuesday next week or some later date and time, you'd be considering adopting an ordinance that would adopt the Planning Commission's recommendations as amended by this matrix, right? So then this is your work that you're doing. So we're going to largely stay in this document as you go through your deliberations. Is that helpful? Okay.
Mayor Malchow, did you have a question?
Sorry, I'm unmuting you here. Yeah, and my questions actually were centered around that matrix that was just brought up. So I don't know if you want me to go ahead and dive into that, or if Jeff, if you guys have a presentation on those first, or do you want me to just dive in?
Well, we're going to walk through those items one by one once we take general questions. Mayor,
nope, mine are specific. So
yeah. So I think maybe hold on those, and then as we get to each item, we'll have that discussion on each one.
Okay. So Karen, put me back in the queue after he's done. All right. Thank you.
All right. So I'm going to turn it back over to David again, and as he flashed on the screen a moment ago, we're going to go through these. There's there's 10 of these, and then there's another series of maybe 13 or so proposed amendments that came from our legal counsel review. Those are what we would consider to be fairly minor in nature. It's change a word here or there, add a comma type of thing. So we're not going to go through those one by one. We're going to assume that we all want to adhere to our legal counsel's advice and change those singular words or add those commas where they feel that it's appropriate. So we're just going to go through the ones from council members and from the Master Builders Association and get direction from you. Again, whether you want us to proceed with doing work on this between now and Monday, to update this even further and bring it back to you polished on Tuesday next week. David?
The first item was proposed, and this is, I believe, the one that one of our members of our audience spoke to, and it's a proposal that we add clarification that detached accessory dwelling units meeting the standard setback may be taller than 18 feet up to the 35-foot height limit for structures in that district. So it's not that's not meeting the setback that's the variable setback. It's meeting the first setback in those three buckets that applies to all structures. So it would apply to a carport, a shed, a detached accessory dwelling unit that's exceeding the minimum requirements and meeting the next bracket of setbacks, if that makes sense. So what this is if you're meeting the setback that applies to all structures, the generic setback, that you could then have a height limit, your height is increased. However, if you're taking advantage of the 5-foot setback, you'd be limited to 18 feet. That's what this is. If I understand this correctly, that's what this is proposing.
So the question for council is, would you like us to do some work on this to bring this back as a polished proposed code amendment next week?
Can I ask a question?
Councilmember Hornish?
So I think that then means if you have to comply with the setbacks for the ADU to allow it to be taller, it would only allow the taller ADU on a much larger lot. Is that correct?
Not necessarily. What would happen is if the ADU was farther away from the property line and applying a bigger setback than the 5-foot setback, and you're meeting the next setback, it would allow you to go up to 35 feet. So it doesn't relate to lot size in that instance.
Well, I'm trying to think that if you have the setbacks, though, doesn't that make it require a bigger lot if you have to have the setback for the ADU as well to get to 35? I mean, that means the ADU has to be farther away from the back and the side, presumably not the front.
In theory, it would. It just depends on the shape of the lot. I wouldn't say that it would always require a larger lot. It just depends on multiple factors.
Okay. Yeah, okay. That's why I said kind of generally, but okay. I said there could be circumstances. Okay, thanks.
So you're looking for some direction from?
Yeah, so we can do this two ways. We can just look at the four heads nodding one way or the other up here and anything we hear over the microphone from our three council members, or if you wanted to just call for us, I'd look to our city attorney, but maybe just a simple vote on whether you'd like us to proceed with doing work on this between now and next week.
To those that we have up on the clouds, can you guys give us some feedback here of a yay or a nay on this?
I would suggest we actually do it with a vote. So I'll make a motion that we provide direction for staff to move forward with coming back with language on this first item.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Discussion? No discussion. Calling for the vote. All in favor say aye.
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 Nay? No nays? Romero?
I said aye.
Okay. Just checking. Okay.
So the second item is one recommended by Mayor Malcho, and this was to amend footnote 21 to restrict the use of setback adjustments to only existing lots. So footnote 21 is where we identified that you could meet with your neighbor, ask your neighbor for a reduction say you wanted to bump out your kitchen or the side of your home, and you had 15 feet between your house and the side yard, and you wanted to go down to a minimum of 5. You could work with your neighbor to enter into agreement to allow for that. I believe what Mayor Malcho was attempting to guard against was that a developer of a property, a subdivision, who would in theory own all of the lots, could not then enter into agreement with themselves for all of the lots and reduce the setbacks down. So the question is, we did draft up some language in response to this, and that's in yellow here. So for this matrix, when we did include language, you'll see that everything is highlighted in yellow. That includes the legal section as well, just so that's an FYI. So in this case, what we said, now realize that footnote 21 does already say that reduction of minimum rear yard and side yard setbacks shall be granted when agreement with the adjoining affected property owners of a parcel under separate ownership has been reached. In this instance, the ask was to go a little bit further, as I understand it. So what we came up with, and again, there's a dial here that you can turn, or a lever you can move, and the setback reduction granted under this part shall not be available for or applicable to lots created through the subdivision process for 3 years following creation of the lots at recording of final plat. So that's, again, a lever. You could say 1 year, you could say 6 months, you could say 5 years.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions here, so let's go start with Councilmember Ross, second by Councilmember Stewart.
Okay, I like the ad, but what I was thinking about when I was looking at this note earlier is when we talk about separate owners or owners, can we define the owners further as owner occupied or landlord or something to that effect? Would that help?
Is the purpose to guard against sort of a rental unit?
No. It's defining owners, because you can, this period is more ownership by an LLC in a series of owned units or owned housing units, and so the agreement by an owner occupied or rented household, because the LLCs usually, well, the developers are not going to be renting out their units, they're selling it. So that last clause protects against any type of abuse of this language, but we could further delineate that by being very specific of who can, what type of owner.
Yeah, we could take a crack at that. I think I see what you're saying is that not only that, but you might have an instance where, say, you were up against a HOA-owned tract on one side, and would that mean that you would go to the HOA tract ownership, which would be your HOA, to ask for a reduction? It's unclear. So would you want us to limit this necessarily to lots that have homes on them, or would you want us to allow that to also occur in the instance of, say, like an open space tract that's owned by an HOA?
Yeah. Look at it. I just kick that around. I think there is a way to be more specific of who we intend to have these negotiations and agreements. And you got a good point on tracts without a house.
Good comment. Thank you.
Councilmember Stewart, then Councilmember Hornish.
So is the intent of this yellow highlighted, again, to further ensure that developer who, can't ask themselves for permission, and would it restrict if I am a landowner and I'm trying to build a single home, and I need a variance for some reason, and could I get permission, or does this time frame then restrict anybody, even if I just have one house? So I'm not completely clear on what the intent and what the actual language would restrict.
So anybody would always be eligible to apply for a variance. It's a separate process, right?
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean variance. I mean get the permission for the setback reduction.
Yeah, but it's a good point that if you felt like you were aggrieved in some way, or you had a hardship of some type, and you were not eligible for this, you would always be eligible to apply for a variance. So long as it would not be a grant of special privilege, and so long as there's a pattern already in existence of what you're proposing, typically you would receive your variance based on those factors. There's a list of criteria in the code for a variance. That aside, based on this proposed footnote 21, what we're trying to guard against with the 3-year period is that typically, in order for you to build out, we typically see plats or final plats built out within a number of years following recording of the final plat. So what this is guarding against is that if you were to sell off the lots individually, there's nothing to say that a builder or developer couldn't do a paper plat exercise and plat out the land and then install the infrastructure and then sell the lots off to individual builders who would then be able to come in and say that it's under separate ownership, and amongst themselves they could negotiate, you know, a reduction of setbacks. So what this is saying is that for the purpose of predictability, we really don't want recently divided plats to be eligible for this negotiated reduction of setback between neighbors. And you could argue that maybe 5 years is an appropriate timeline. If you wanted it to better match RCW 58, I used to have this one memorized, but 17, and there's a subsection in there about how long you're vested following recording of final plat for the purpose of building homes. We could match it to that, because there is an expectation that you enjoy a certain level of protection following a recording of a final plat for the purpose of construction of a new single-family home, in that you're protected to those codes that were in place at the time that you applied for your preliminary plat. So what happens is we could actually pin that number of years to that if you wanted us to, so that's consistent.
So I'm always amazed, David, with your knowledge of the code. Unfortunately, that didn't answer my question. I'm so sorry.
Sorry.
But it was incredibly impressive. And it does raise a good point, because if there is other code that speaks to this, it probably does make sense to align things. I like symmetry, so we may want to think about that. But I'm asking more because this specifically calls out subdivision process. Does that mean if I own, you know, a half an acre or a quarter of an acre in an R4 zoning, and I want to build a house on that, I have not gone through any sort of subdivision process, does this yellow part restrict me from being able to get special permission from my neighbor to do to get a reduction in my setback?
Provided that neither lot that's subject to the agreement is not subject to the yellow. So if you've got two tax parcels, neither are subject to the yellow being created through a subdivision process within X amount of time, whatever we land on,
right,
the answer is no.
Okay, thank you.
Now, Councilmember Hornish.
Yes, thanks. David, I was actually a little concerned about the 3 years, and I guess kind of just to make the point, I like the idea of tying it to the amount of time that a somebody that subdivides then has to build. Do you have any idea what that magnitude is? Is it 5, 7, or because what I'm concerned about is if we have a downturn in the economy, and 3 years later they come back and they go, hey, I've got a loophole. All at once I can change everything now amongst myself. So the 3 years I'm a little concerned about.
It's 5 years for lots that were created during good economic time, and 7 years for lots that were created during economic downturn. So if you recall, the legislature changed the RCW 5817 or whatever it is. There's a specific section. Jeff's actually looking it up right now, and what it says is that for subdivisions approved during a certain time frame, you get 7 years, because the expectation is that the economy was a little slower and it might take you a little longer to build out the project. But for those projects that were created during this other time frame, you only get 5 years, because the economy was good in those years, is my understanding, and that you could have built out your project in a reasonable time frame.
Okay, I just, me personally, I kind of like that because it addresses the concern I have about good times, bad times. But that's my thought. Okay.
So we can work on amending this language if you'd like to reference it more closely back to RCW 5817 and the time limitations included therein.
I'm certainly opposed to that, and if you need a formal motion, I'll move that we direct staff to build out language relative to the highlighted yellow, and if tying it back to that RCW works, I'm certainly amenable to that as well.
Second.
Oh, okay, so we have a motion and a second. And any discussion? Nope.
Yes, I have a question.
Oh, I guess, yes.
Note, Karen, just I'll keep firing you notes that when I have a question. And the question was going back to where did the number 3 come from for 3 years, taking into account what was said? Is that a standard practice in the area, or how did the number 3 get here?
3 years came from years of experience watching development occur and the approximate time frame that it takes for all of the homes to be built and sold on a division following the point of recording a final plat. So I would say that's data collected over the years, just watching these projects and being exposed to hundreds of projects a year. I would say that again, like I pointed out in the initial part of this presentation, was that's a dial or a lever, and it's a place to start. So if the council wanted us to increase the number or decrease the number or eliminate this altogether, we could do that.
I'm fine with it. I just wanted to know if that was staff recommendation based upon past practices. Thank you.
Okay, seeing or hearing no other discussion, I'm going to call for the vote. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed?
Aye.
Oh, opposed? All right.
The next item, number 3, it comes from the Master Builders Association of King and Snohomish County. This is a letter that we received yesterday afternoon, and this is also consistent with the conversation we'd had with them in a meeting we held with them, I believe, on February 6th. And what this calls for is an increase in the allowance of excavation from 10 feet to 20 feet. The current proposed draft limits excavation on site to 10 feet. And what this does is it would increase the amount of allowed excavation from 10 feet to 20 feet.
Councilmember Ritchie.
Simple question, why? Does it make a difference? Is there a member in the audience in the building industry that could explain to us why an increase from 10 to 20 feet would be important or necessary and why?
My understanding is that it provides additional flexibility across larger sites. So if you had a large site like, say, the Connor Jarvis site, 10, 20, 30 acre site, which we do have a few of here in the city still, that once you get to the middle of a site, it becomes challenging if you're trying to grade out and smooth out the topography of a site. So if you were limited to 10 feet, you might not be able to adequately address the desired smoothing or topographical change at any portion of the property just based on the size. Smaller project sites would not typically have as much of a problem as this as a larger site, where if you were looking across the entire cross section of the property, a 10-foot change would limit them to how much grade could occur. We landed at 10 feet initially because we understood that the council and the planning commission were interested in limiting the amount of topographic change that could occur from the natural grade of this project site, because that is something that ultimately changes character. So that was where we landed on 10 feet. 20 feet would be up to the council if you wanted to allow them to go to 20 feet, and that's up to you.
And remember, tonight you're not deciding whether to approve this or not. You're just deciding on whether you'd like us to work on this in advance of your next meeting on Tuesday.
Then I'll make a motion that we go ahead and ask staff to further evaluate this and the increase of allowance of excavation from 10 to 20 feet and report back to us as to, feasibility and frankly, how many plats we're talking about, and just gets more information. I think it's important to make a more well-informed decision.
Yep, second.
Okay, we have a first and a second. Discussion, and in queue, we have got Councilmember Ross.
Throw me in the queue too, Karen.
Okay.
Okay, in looking at this, David, you mentioned our subdivision size. can you, in your analysis, factor in some of that? Because it's just strictly 10 to 20, and it doesn't differentiate when 20 can be used. It could be any size plat or subdivision. So
If you wanted us to try to pin the 10 versus 20 to a lot size or scale or proportionality of the project?
is there other jurisdictions that have similar code gain excavation down to 20 feet? And of course, our topography is different than other jurisdictions. Yeah. But I certainly would like to see benchmarking and how they do tie it to size.
So note that this would also apply to individual single-family lots that are already in existence, or would also apply to other sites in the city. This is out of the city's general clearing and grading code. So it would apply to pretty much all projects in the city, except for, as we included exceptions for roads, stormwater vaults, other structures that don't change the surface topography, like a foundation of a building, et cetera. So just making sure we're all aware of that, how this would apply. It's something that when we start to add more complexity to how it applies, it becomes really difficult for staff. Because it's the if then that this then this, and there's just a whole host of scenarios that we end up in, and unless you know all the little nuances and details, then we're kind of caught in the corner like we didn't realize.
Yeah, that's fair. I think really bottom line is find out why we want to go from 10 to 20 and what's the advantages and disadvantages of doing so.
And we can ask the master builders members that provided that. And I think we also have in their letter, there's some detail that support why they think they want this already.
We have a representative of master builders here. In the spirit of this discussion, to get to the point of directing us to do something or not, would you like to call Ms. Clark up to if she has any additional thoughts to offer?
Sure. Do you want to come and answer that? Because
we're here now, we might as well. So.
Yeah. Yeah, because I'd like to know why maybe not 15. And then in queue, we have got Mayor Melcho and Councilmember Hornish.
So I think David answered a lot of that. Like he said, we had met, I think it was on February 6th, and we had discussed this, and it offers flexibility for the larger sites. As he mentioned, our smaller sites won't probably come near that, but it does offer some flexibility. There's also some flexibility too when it comes to moving, I think we had talked about moving lots of earth off of sites and taking trips, big loads of dirt off of sites and being able to keep that fill and excavation on sites as well. So it's a matter, I wish somebody was more technical that was here. I'm a policy wonk, but.
I believe that the way it was described was that sometimes you have unsuitable soils on a property,
Yes.
and you're required to remove those soils in order to import soils that can adequately serve
right.
for compaction and for support. Yep.
And building the right kind of soils that you want on site. So instead of having 50 trucks constantly coming and going on and off site, we can move that and try and keep the topography, like David was saying, similar on the outside of the properties, but then when it comes to the inside of the properties, you're going to be doing some deep grading and moving of earth within that centerpiece of the property, and then having to do compaction and bringing in different types of soils in. So that's the best I can kind of do with the technical knowledge I have, yeah.
Okay, Mayor Melchow, and then Councilmember Hornish.
Yeah, I think I'd like to understand before giving direction to staff to do this, when we're talking about moving more earth, we're talking about a further disturbance of the land. And I'm thinking there has got to be some type of environmental impact. I mean, obviously you're getting one anyway if you're disturbing up to 10 feet, but if you're going twice as deep, I'm assuming that there is an additional environmental impact. And I'm curious if staff that is present tonight might be able to comment on that end.
I can comment about my experience with earth moving and what we notice on our end from the city development management end is that when sites remove more soils, especially in a city like Sammamish that has fairly complex and restrictive tree protection rules, it tends to be a little bit of a collision between the applicant's desire to grade a property and the city's expectation that the applicant will adequately protect required protected preserved trees. One of the reasons why we put the limit on excavation to 10 feet was that it helps limit the amount of excavation across the site on a larger scale. And what that does is it limits the amount of existing native topsoil that's being removed. It helps protect soils' rates of infiltration. It's really a true form of low impact development. It also helps us and facilitates application of tree protection areas. Sometimes we see builders, in order to protect a tree where they want to remove soil, building rockeries around the root zones of these trees. So you kind of have a tree that's on an island after the project is built. So generally speaking, from our end, in order for us to apply many of the goals that we're trying to apply to projects, such as infiltration on site, tree preservation, retention of existing vegetation, retention of existing topography and character, generally limiting the amount of excavation that can occur helps us meet that end goal. I do understand the other side of it as presented by the builders that, hey, if you're limiting us, then you're limiting us across the board, and there's no flexibility in that. Our proposal, and if you see what some of the items were that the Planning Commission had recommended for further consideration in phase 2, is that we, as part of a plan unit development code, or any other type of tool we could add to the code, allow for flexibility when the perimeter is retained. But we started looking at blending of grades and the perimeter rule, and it is really hard to create a perimeter rule that applies to all projects, because you might have a project, the geometry or the size of the project or the scale of grading is so different across the board. So much like what one of our members of our public spoke to tonight, with a more of a holistic approach, a plan unit development type project would actually be able to look at those issues more closely, and it would engage the community at a higher level. So we opted to propose that we include that in phase 2, with the idea that any future grading rules or flexibilities could be written into a plan unit development code section.
Perfect. I think that was kind of what I was looking for, and I think the tree issue alone will cause me not to support this motion to direct staff to look into changing this. I also trust that the Planning Commission thoroughly vetted this as well, so I will not be supporting this motion.
Councilmember Hornish, then followed by Councilmember Valderrama, and then Councilmember Stewart.
David, did we have any limit on excavation in our code before?
No.
It was unlimited. Okay. I'm kind of open to this in general for a very, 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 very large project. But I guess I'm kind of thinking that can be addressed even better with a little bit more discussion and thought process in phase 2. So, okay, that's where I'm at. Okay, thanks.
Councilmember Valderrama.
Yes, I was wondering is there some, when you come back to us on Tuesday, framework that you can put in to define what a large project is, or parameters around the unsuitability of soils that you can come back to us on Tuesday with, and then leave the rest, like perimeter rules in that for phase 2. Is that possible?
Could you repeat that? I didn't make out part of that. My apology.
So following on what Councilmember Hornish said, is it possible by Tuesday to come back with some guidelines or recommendations for what constitutes a large project, and also or unsuitable soils to be looked at?
Yes, if I hear you correctly, you try to pin a restriction on grading based on the scale of the project or on the adequacy of the soils on the site to support the type of development that's proposed.
Correct.
Yes, we can look into that.
Thank you.
Councilmember Stewart.
I think I'm heading in a similar direction, which is, it sounds like this is something that we definitely need to explore in phase 2. In phase 1, might there be a set of exceptions that you feel comfortable identifying in phase 1 where we may consider allowing more because it is actually more beneficial to the environment or to the character as opposed to more detrimental? So I appreciate we've enacted, or we're looking to put a restriction on because we want to protect the environment, and I think that is excellent, but it sounds like there may actually be some exceptions that if we don't address them in phase 1, we could actually be doing one of those things, an unintended consequence that says by creating this restriction, we may actually cause more harm. And so if staff feels like they could come up with a narrow set of exceptions that we would consider and kind of write it in a similar way that we've been looking at the stormwater code that says we need to explore these things because we don't want to create code that actually does more harm than good. We're trying to do more good than harm. So I don't know if that's something you think you could do in the short term.
The challenge for us is that criteria that typically go along with those types of decisions are somewhat subjective in judgment. So the scenario that we regularly end up in with subjective criteria is where an applicant or their engineer or their design team thinks they've met it. We ask for some changes, and then we feel like they probably have met it, and then a neighbor thinks they definitely haven't met it. And that typically comes to head in the form of a public hearing with 2 different attorneys that then have to argue in front of the hearing examiner why they have or have not met it. So we would bring something back that would really try to focus on sort of binary, simple criteria that aren't really judgmental or subjective in nature, because that really puts a lot of pressure on staff and puts us in a bad place between builders and the neighborhood.
Okay.
So that's a place that we're trying not to have our staff land in future code design.
That's fair. I do think it's still worth having you guys see if there are any exceptions you think are worth considering in the short term, especially where it may lead to suitable soils. I mean, that can have impacts on not only the houses, but again, on the stormwater management and things as well.
Sure. So if the council gives us a majority direction to proceed with that, we'll work on that, and Ms. Clark and Master Builders may have some ideas along the way too that they may offer up to us before Tuesday. So
Again, kind of a surgical set of exceptions. Thanks.
Okay,
I guess,
Councilmember Ross.
David, you said earlier it was a complex, but I think what you're trying to do is try to make it more objective than subjective related to large projects and other considerations.
Yes, that's what we're getting here, exactly. Thank you for summarizing it that way. I think that's consistent with my understanding of what I'm hearing here.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other discussion?
I've got a follow-up.
Okay, Councilmember Hornish.
One of the concerns I have, I mean, and I'm looking to staff as far as, I mean, we're talking next week. Do you really have time to kind of take all these factors into account, appropriately weigh them, or, I mean, I think what you're kind of hearing is if we do something, it would be kind of a Band-Aid, and then phase 2 would be much more in depth. I'm concerned about not giving you guys enough time to really think it through, even with the Band-Aid. Do you have that much time?
we're going to give it a go, and the good news for the 7 of you is you'll get to be the judge next week on how we do. So.
Okay, any other discussion? I'd love to entertain a motion.
Move to vote.
We already have a motion, don't we?
Oh.
I thought we did,
Yep,
didn't
we
we?
do have a motion.
Oh.
Yes, that's correct, okay.
Yes, we did.
Oh, we do? All right.
Yeah.
So I'm going to call for the vote, yes.
Can you please repeat the motion? Because I think we added kind of amendment to the motion.
I think the motion is to consider if there are any exceptions to this that we need to add, right?
Yes.
Objective, not subjective. And they'll come back with some recommendations or not.
Yes.
I think the original motion actually was the 20 feet as suggested by Master Builders.
I'm sorry.
Pardon, Mayor Melchar, I couldn't hear that.
I said I believe the motion was what Jason made the motion, and it was what Master Builders suggested, which is 20 feet. There was not a formal amendment.
Let me clarify my motion if I can.
Let's go backward and let's have Councilmember Ritchie clarify his motion.
The motion I was intending here, and that created the discussion that I think gave you some more insight as to the direction of the council, is to direct staff to give us more information on why or under what conditions we would want to increase the allowance for excavation from 10 to 20 feet. There's been many topics, many issues, many perspectives brought up here as to why. I think you've answered a bunch of them. Thank you for that. But to me, it's, do we want, I mean, more to Councilmember Hornish's perspective, do you have the time to do that? And if you don't, you don't. But for me, I think it's a question of, do we want to talk about this, or do we want to have you, do we want to direct you to spend your time and staff time overall on this issue? And that's my motion, to direct staff to further investigate the increase in allowance of excavation from 10 to 20 feet with everything we've discussed in mind.
Yeah, so with 4 votes, we'll work on code language to bring back to you that addresses this next week with the discussion that we've made notes on here this evening.
Thank you.
All right. So calling for the votes. Okay, all in favor say aye.
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 All opposed, say nay.
Nay.
Okay, we have a 6-1 vote.
So 3 down, 7 to go.
Oh, we're going to take a Sammamish 5.
Thank you.
damaged tree protection zones. Maybe we've had a few.
Nothing recent. I'm shocked again. No, but the fact is we're here talking about it and we're getting a second shot, so you can shut the hell up.
Yeah, so we'll, yeah, I mean, we're,
Well,
no, that's the Senate. I get it mixed up.
okay.
What's the order of the vote?
Yeah,
So let's get it done.
yeah,
So just plan this out.
in one chamber.
yeah. And that's, we're here to, I hear both sides, I see both sides.
I know you do, and I used to be on your side of things, so.
Yeah.
So let's just work it out because I understand where, where that's going to too. I don't understand the way the process is. So if the city shuts down, that's a problem.
Yeah.
So that's an issue.
Yeah, I
And
see
if
that
we
too.
take our poison away, we'll be tomorrow.
Yeah.
So, but I want them to keep their poison.
Yeah. Yeah, so finding the balance.
Right, absolutely. And like all of this conversation should have
If the market makes sense, if not, let's just keep running forever.
Exactly. But they are typically,
Yeah,
they'll
and
That's a long time ago, so let's forget about it.
hopefully.
I see, you know,
There won't have to be all.
adding a bunch of
Construction for.
resource to doing this. Round two has like a whole different
Right.
timeline, different group, and it involves, you know, a whole team of people.
And it'll be a fresh set of eyes too, which could.
But I will agree, before 10 years ago, before
But it could also be
especially with
things out
there was a lot of shiny construction.
could
And some of
impact
those
the
were
Yeah.
so the wall went too far, now it's going back.
Yeah, so the next one is, you know, the next one that you included. So we're trying to make sure that we, you know, put everything in there, walking.
Okay, Lita, I think I have everybody on.
Okay, sounds good.
Yep.
Romero, are you on just to be sure?
I am.
All right, cool.
You guys are done now, right? I guess they're not.
They're just on a break right now.
Oh, okay, that's why. Like I figured they'd finish the rest of the set.
We're all getting our snacks.
I wasn't going to, but it looks like it's going to go a while.
Thought we were gonna.
I know. We didn't have an option.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
Do we have everybody back up?
Yep.
All right.
Yep.
Do I have to wait for this? There we go. Okay, coming back from break. And we're going to go right back into our meeting.
Thank you. Item 4, and this one is largely similar to the one to item 3. It's the opposite. Increase allowance for fill instead of cut in this case from 5 feet to 10 feet and increase the maximum allowed for fill from 8 feet to 15 feet in exceptional circumstances. So the proposed draft that the Planning Commission put forward to you included an allowance for fill for 5 feet, and it included an allowance to go up to 8 feet in exceptional circumstances, and it listed out what exceptional circumstances were. What this is a proposal to just increase that amount. And again, for the same reasons as I understand it. And in this case, it would be, the 10 foot would be the base limit, but you could go up to 15 feet if you met the list of exceptional circumstances.
Okay, we're going to start with Councilmember Stewart.
I move that we ask staff to consider this. My recommendation, though, would be that you leave the base at 5 and you just say up to 15 feet in exceptional circumstances. So you kind of start at the same place, but you give a little more wiggle room if there is an exceptional circumstance. So that would be my motion.
Second.
We have a first and a second discussion. Actually, I have a question on this. Because we built our house and we found a ton of fill on our lot and had to put in the pony wall and the da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So I'm very apprehensive when I start hearing about lots of fill being moved around. So I want more of an explanation for this one. And I'm going to ask for that from... Would it be easier for me if I just, made it for you to, include the research so it came back to us next week?
I was just going to say those words.
That would be perfect, too. All right.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Okay, so get it to staff, ASAP.
It is similar to what we were saying, but I'd be happy to meet with you in person, too. So
Okay.
if you want me to come up here and meet, and I can bring an engineer with me, too. Your staff obviously is well-versed in this as well. So I trust what your staff is going to be saying, too. But if you need to rely from us, I can also bring an engineer and meet with anybody or community members who are concerned. I'd be happy to do that.
All right.
Yeah.
Let me see if I have anybody else in my... let's see, I do.
Here, I'll bring it up if you don't have a queue.
Okay, Councilmember Stewart, then I believe I just heard Mayor Melchak.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that, again, this is just asking staff to explore this and to bring us more information back. Not that we necessarily need to move it, but just so we can understand if there's any rationale there, and what, again, sort of pros and cons. So.
Okay. Mayor Melchak, and then Councilmember Hornish.
Christie, you unmute.
Mayor Melchak?
Oh, yep, there I am. Thank you. Yep, there. Sorry, I was talking with it on mute. Okay, so I'm curious. The staff presented this. Master Builders is requesting it. Does staff have a recommendation, and was this discussed at the Planning Commission at all?
It was discussed with the Planning Commission. There was some discussion around how much fill is needed typically to support things like gravity drainage when you're trying to design a project to work. How much fill might be required to smooth out undulations in a site due to natural topography. There's also fill that is sometimes required for the purpose of construction of a road, some cut, some fill. And we feel that the amount that's presented here is reasonable. There's always a variance process that someone could go through if they feel like there's a hardship. So what we're trying to do is to put some parameters around standard activities in the city, and that if someone wants or has a reason to request a deviation from that, they could. So say a standard subdivision comes in the door, they could apply for a variance that goes along with that. That would be a variance from the limitation on fill if they had a valid reason for that. That would have to have been processed as part of the subdivision. The neighborhood would be aware of it because that would be bundled with it. What we experience is when the machine, it's one thing to have a project go through plan review with the preliminary subdivision where the neighbors might be aware of it and see the plan sets, but when the machines show up and the dirt starts moving, we go through a whole nother round of comments that when we don't even have a comment period. So how this would work here is that a builder would be necessarily limited to what's prescriptively in the code if they felt that that caused a hardship for them as part of their preliminary subdivision, which is the point in time when the neighborhood is being made aware of it and has opportunity to comment on it. They could then include a variance with that. That's something that's appealable. It's something that would go in front of the hearing examiner. If we had a higher level of allowed fill or a higher level going back to the cut, similar to that, we might experience quite a bit of, I guess, dissatisfaction on the part of a neighbor or a community member when they realize that what is happening is prescriptively allowed by code and they think staff should be doing something to limit it.
Okay. And Councilmember Hornish.
So,
oops.
Oh,
sorry.
Sorry. So, David, I just wanted to confirm because you said what's presented here, but I want to make sure confirm that staff's recommendation is what's presented by that came up through the Planning Commission or what was presented by Master Builders. I'm assuming the Planning Commission. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and then the one last comment I wanted to just make is that there are a lot of items here, and staff has, today is Thursday night, and they have to have this back to us in a packet. They have very little time, and I'm very concerned about how many items there are here and how much we're charging staff with to come back in a very, very short time period. So because there is another opportunity for that phase 2, and there is a variance process in place that someone can use if they have a circumstance to which it's needed, I do not support having staff look into this.
Okay. Can I have, Jeff, do you want to answer? Did you have?
Yeah, nothing real different from what I had said previously. We're in this to try and help get you to the finish line successfully, and David and I are committed to doing what we need to do. We're not going to have this out in the packet tomorrow. Let me forewarn you of that. We'll probably need to work on it. The earnest plan would be to get Tammy in our clerk's office to add this to the packet sometime on Monday, so to give you at least 24 hours to take a look at it. So, and we certainly would appreciate your patience with us while we work on it for a couple days here.
I think we have a busy weekend anyway.
Yeah, you've got a few things going on, I think. So.
Okay, so I'm going to go Councilmember Hornish. I believe you're next in queue, followed by Councilmember Ritchie.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand how it really parallels the one that we just talked about from the 10 to 20 excavation, because I'm not seeing the same rationale for a large lot, which is what we kind of qualified that prior one to, I think. And I guess I'm going to kind of circumvent. I'd like to get an answer to that. I just think we can get the answer later on, and I'm concerned about us being able to even digest what the staff comes back with in time by next Tuesday to move forward, but I think that's why we have a phase 2.
Councilmember Ritchie?
Yeah, so taken as a whole, more to the comments I was just hearing from other council members, to me, the goal here is to try to get a little bit more understanding during our conversations here and some of the issues that were brought up by council members and by staff, by the master builders and other partners, community partners. I guess my thought is I would want to support these going forward in as much as the answers may be pretty straightforward or they may not be pretty straightforward. I would rather give staff the ability to look at the ones that are, hey, there's an easy answer. Oh, there's something pretty straightforward. Here's a pretty straightforward set of options we can give the council by Tuesday or by Monday night, whenever it is. I mean, no rush, right? If it's not ready for prime time, you're not going to give it to us. Or you're going to say, we're not ready to present number 4, number 5, number 6, whatever it is. But to me, the goal for me is to encourage staff at our direction, if we can get to 4 on any of these, or the rest of these, or however many we're going to get to encourage staff or to direct staff specifically to try to figure out the answers to these questions, or present options for the council to review next week. If it's not ready, it's not ready. And I don't want to, it certainly isn't my intention from this seat to try to put undue pressure on you or have there be anything rushed in any way, shape, or form, recognizing that we do have a phase 2 and that we can plug those in. But there are some pretty specific things here that have been brought to our attention. Is it worthy of your time? that's what we're trying to figure out. We're not saying yay or nay to any of them on a formalized basis. So I'm recognizing your time, but hoping you can invest the appropriate time as you see fit between now and Monday night, and then the rest will get into phase 2. So thank you.
Okay, I've got a bunch of people queued up here. So I have got Council Member Ross, followed by Council Member Stewart, followed by Council Member Hornish.
No, you take me off. I'm done.
Okay.
My main concern on these later ads, last-minute write-ups, is it's not giving both us, but more importantly, the public for this to marinate. And that's my chief concern. And it feels more like a phase 2 effort at this juncture.
Am I good?
And then we have Council Member Stewart.
So I think we're all trying to say the same thing, which is we don't want to make any rash decisions. We certainly don't want to do anything that doesn't go through the appropriate process. I guess what I would add on that, that's a slightly different twist, is people have raised some questions. I think as part of the due diligence, we should look at that and ask staff to take a look and see, has anyone raised something that has identified an inconsistency or something that needs to be addressed that we may have missed? This is part of the public process that we're going through, right? This is the public hearing. So I guess that's really maybe, and maybe Mr. City Manager can help articulate this better, but I think for us to just say, we're done, this is too much, this is all phase 2. I think the idea of having the public hearing as people raise some questions, and we do, as part of our due diligence, need to at least take a look and have staff come back and say, here are the pros and cons, or hey, we're not sure, we maybe need to do more, or no, we think we're good to go. And I think that all of those are valid responses that staff can come back with in looking at these. But I feel like to just summarily say, we don't have enough time, we're done, well, is probably not what the intention of having the public hearing is. So that's, maybe we can look at it differently and say, are there any on this list that we shouldn't have staff take a look at and come back with any information? And again, you can come back with any number of responses. Yes, we should consider something new. We looked at this and we found this, or no, there's nothing, these are not the droids you're looking for, or this one we actually aren't sure, we need more time to dig into. I think any of those are fair responses. So maybe we could look at it as opposed to going through these one by one. Are there any we just want to take off the list for any particular reason? But to just say we're out of time doesn't seem like the whole point of this public process.
Okay, before we get into round 2, I'm actually going to make a comment because I'm going to expand on that. And I'd like to look at that, for you to look at that, and staff, look at that list, because I'm hearing from well, at least from all the heads nodding up here, I don't think anybody's going to say, you know, no, we don't want you to find out about that. So maybe what we need to hear from you is we can't do due diligence to this and bring it back to you by Tuesday. So you look at that list and say, okay, really, this isn't something we can do by Tuesday, and take that and leave that to you to say, this needs to come back, but we can't get and do a good job on this by Tuesday. Because that doesn't mean you're not bringing it back, but it may mean that, you know, you can't do that kind of the job you need to do on it and bring it back on Tuesday. Sure. Because there's nothing that we're going to tell you not to look at, frankly.
So, and that's fine. I think this exercise was designed if there was, for example, rounding is on here a little further down. If the council is not interested in providing any additional flexibility or relief in regards to rounding, that may be a non-starter for the council. So you may not want us to do any work on that in density rounding. But the fact of the matter is, David and I had a chance to talk about this before the meeting tonight. We're prepared to bring back a minimum of at least one option for each of these as a code amendment for you to consider on Tuesday. So if there's no compelling majority of the city council that is not interested in seeing at least one proposed option of code amendment for each of these 10 items, then we'll be back on Tuesday with at least one proposed option for a code amendment for these on Tuesday. Ms. Clark with Master Builders, as the initiator of 6 of these. It would probably be helpful to provide maybe some additional written comment to the city council before Tuesday night's meeting, perhaps by the end of the day, Monday, to support your initiatives on these. And then Tuesday night, you can decide to take some of these, take none of them, mix and match, whatever you'd like to do.
Okay, and then Mayor Melchow, you had one more comment you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just want to clarify because I'm not closing the door on looking at these items. I think staff has mentioned that there's that phase 2, and I'm not trying to circumvent a public process because staff has said that the Planning Commission has already discussed these, at least this one in particular, and I guess maybe that's my next question to staff, is which one of these, or are all of them, because I think the first 2 we've hit from Master Builders have already gone through the Planning Commission process. Which of the rest of these has already been vetted through the Planning Commission?
Each of these.
Because I think my point is that there were already public hearings. That comment was already taken in once before by the Planning Commission, and they bubbled up what we have before us. So what I'm hearing is that we're hearing it again, but it's not a first time that we're hearing this. It was tried through the Planning Commission, and the Planning Commission declined, or maybe, and maybe staff can comment on this as well, that they came up with a compromise on many of these. So there has been a public process, and I think that's important to note. There were public hearings at the Planning Commission level, and we're having them here, but these are not new. They have been vetted.
Is there a reason that we are in an emergency to have them back by Tuesday? Are we on a time limit or something that I'm not aware of?
We're on no time. Your public hearing was tonight. Tuesday was the next regular business meeting to have any possibility of you taking action on permanent regulations.
So to give you more time to do your work and, that maybe that you just need more time rather than have it on next week's agenda.
The challenge for us is the longer this process goes on, it starts to, kind of like the housing strategy back in January, the longer that process went on, the more it was going to start to interfere with other orders of business we have on our work program, and that the Planning Commission and you have on your work program as well. So, again, we're prepared to be back with a minimum of at least one code amendment option for these on Tuesday next week. If the council wants to do something else in terms of schedule, that's obviously your prerogative. So.
All right. So, hang on.
Sorry.
Councilmember Stewart.
One more thing. I hate to throw this out there because we're already talking, but we did get some feedback tonight as part of the public hearing about the difference between the 4 feet and the 5 feet, and I would like to know if that's something that you guys think we should look at, if there's an inconsistency there that we might need to close on that. Again, you don't have to answer that right away. You can take that and come back, or maybe you already know.
So this first phase has always been intended to be more of what I call the tectonic shifting of the code. It's trying to get the concepts right. It's trying to line up the way the code works and how the pieces work together. Those amendments that I heard tonight are more cleanup amendments. That's phase 2. Phase 2 is where we intend on unpacking the entire code and parking all of the concepts and then reassembling the whole thing and cleaning it up. There's a lot of opportunity to streamline and simplify our code. We also have old, outdated references to percentages or ratios, and there are numerous errors in the code because we basically took King County's code and we've been patching it for how many years. It's time for us to take it apart, overhaul it, and put it back together. There are many, many more instances of things that, like what were raised tonight, in other sections of the code. So my preference would be to defer that to phase 2 because those are cleanup items that will be addressed as part of phase 2.
Okay. The particular one that was raised where we allow excavation to 5 feet, but you don't need a permit above 4 feet, is that particular one going to cause a problem? And I guess that, I appreciate what you're saying, and I totally get that. Like, there's a whole lot of that. But I guess there's sort of that responsibility that comes when something's been pointed out to you, that if this specific thing's been pointed out and a problem could be caused by that, is that something we need to address? And again, I trust your judgment on that, so I just want to throw that out there as something that, you know, if you think that's not a big deal, I trust your judgment. If we feel like now that it's been raised, we probably need to address it, then I'll defer that to you. Thanks.
Okay, then in queue, we have Councilmember Valderrama.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm supportive of continuing to look at these issues and the public process. To the earlier comments, we've always had public hearings with the Planning Commission, and then the council looks at them. We have a different prism that we're looking at some of these points, and frankly, we have new information that's been coming to us as well in the last couple of days in. The comments that we've been hearing here, I think you make it important that we look at this. We have had a de facto moratorium, as has been mentioned by public comment for the last 5 months. And so I'd like to see what can be considered and look at it. As earlier, Councilmember Stewart even mentioned that some of these may actually be adverse to the environment as an unintended consequence. So I'd like to have them come back to us as an additional alternative. My question, going back to what Councilmember Moran had asked, was maybe it shouldn't be Tuesday. Maybe we could give them some more time to be able to work with the community stakeholders and come back with a look. It doesn't have to be the 6 months or that. We've already agreed to extend this. So if there's no crushing time for Tuesday, maybe we push it back 1 week. Thoughts?
I don't believe I have anybody else in queue.
Do you need a motion to move this forward, or are we good? Do you need a motion to? All right.
I would love a motion.
I would like to move that we allow staff to go back and do what they've said 5 or 10 or 20 times that they can do, which is to look at each of these and come back with at least one option by Tuesday. Certainly the council will have the option on Tuesday to accept or ask for more information, but so I move that we let staff come back to us with what they can by Tuesday, with whatever responses, and we go from there.
Second.
Can I ask for clarification? Which ones are you talking about? You said all of these. All of these is what?
All of the ones that are listed on the list that we were reviewing here.
There's 10 of them, right?
The first 4 have passed, right?
Okay.
So we're just talking about
So
5 through 10, right?
everything that we haven't already done, just throw them into a bundle.
First 3.
I want to
First 3. 4 through 10.
Okay, so I can't hear when everybody's talking at once. So Christy and Tom, I didn't hear either one of you.
I would, if she can amend that, or I can propose an amendment, I'd prefer that I think we're looking at 4 through 10 at this point. If it can be 4 through 9, because I would like to specifically discuss number 10, because I would like it to look different than what is stated there.
Okay.
We'd be happy to skip forward to 10.
Sure, so 4 through.
All right, I will amend my motion. Can we bundle 4 through 9 all together and allow staff to do what they've said they can already do?
Second.
Discussion.
I got a comment.
I do too.
Okay, an amendment to an amendment?
No, she retracted her motion. It's a new motion. 4 through 9 is the seconded motion.
Okay, so, and you have an amendment to this motion? Is that what you said?
I've got a comment, not an amendment.
It's discussion.
Yeah.
Okay, discussion. Okay, so we will go Mayor Melchow first, and then Councilmember Hornish second.
Okay. So as staff just stated, Master Builders had brought these forward to the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission has already vetted these. I realize that means staff probably already has another option. available for these, but because they have already gone through a public process, including a public hearing, I will not be supporting this because I think it's already been vetted.
Councilmember Hornish?
I think this is indicative of who we are, that we need to make some decisions and move forward. And I think this puts too much on the backs to be able to move forward quickly.
Okay, so do I hear any other discussion? Okay, hang on. Okay, Councilmember Valderrama.
Yes, I would say that this is the process that it has to go through the deliberations. It's the standard process of the Planning Commission, then to the council. It's been done on each process to date. Also, staff has told us that they can do this, and they're bringing it back in a timely fashion for action. So I'm supportive of this. Thank you.
Okay, so being no more discussion, I'm going to call for the vote. All in favor say aye. Aye.
What are we voting?
We're
On the motion.
we're voting on the motion.
Four through nine.
Amendment open. We had an amendment on 4 through 9.
No, she
No.
retracted.
She just made a statement on 4
The
through
motion
9.
was 4 through 9 after Malchow retracted it, so she rewrote her motion, right?
Yeah, so it's move 4 through 9 forward,
Which she wants to talk about 10.
and then
Okay.
we'll talk about 10 separately.
So,
4 through 9.
4 through
4
9.
through 9. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
Nay.
Okay, it is a 5-2 vote.
Number 10.
Number 10.
So number 10 was a recommendation, or I guess this stems from a discussion that we had with Mayor Malchow regarding SMC 21A250706D, and this is the section of the code that discusses rounding of fractions. So if you recall, for short subdivisions, when you're less than 9 lots, you round up when you're over 0.71, when you're equal to or over 0.71. For long plats, when you are at 9 or more lots, you round up at 0.51 when you're greater than or equal to 0.51. And that then for those projects that include up to 25% townhomes or duplexes of the total number of units in the development, that you round up, I think it was 0.21. So the discussion here is 0.21 too low was one of the first things. The other one was, should we be requiring an increase in the percentage of duplex and townhome units in order to be eligible for that? So I think there's two dials there. One is the 0.21 fraction, and the other is the ratio or the percentage of townhomes and duplexes in the development.
So Karen, if I can speak.
Yeah,
to
so Mayor Malchow, since you've been working on this, I'm going to let you speak to it.
Okay, so as Mr. Pyle had just described, I did talk to staff about this, and my first question was surrounding letter D, which is relative to subdivisions that include townhomes as at least 25% of their total project. We actually lowered the threshold from what used to be you had to have 0.51 in order to qualify, and we've lowered that to 0.21. So my first question for staff was, what was the Planning Commission's rationale? I assumed it was based on the fact that we had a development that had some townhomes, which has some affordability component over single-family homes to it. So that led me to think, and we got into a discussion about, well, what if the rounding was a townhome or a duplex, period? So that and I asked the question too, how many other jurisdictions have rounding in general? And not many. We're really kind of an anomaly in rounding in general. So if we're giving a benefit for a less than whole number to allow for an extra unit, the idea of having that unit be something slightly more affordable seemed like an appealing compromise to allowing for those fractions to produce another unit. So I want to take that one step further, though, because when you're talking about short plats specifically, and I would use an example that's, kind of half of a short plat, which would be, a subdivision that might be on a slightly over 1 acre parcel in an R4 zone, and then it ends up yielding 5 units. The impact of that additional unit is definitively felt more so in the community as a character change over getting an additional unit in, say, a long plat. So I had 2 lines of thought, and one was to omit the rounding at all for short plats, because I think that's where when we're getting comments, and I've heard it on multiple occasions, where people don't understand how they're eking out, 5 homes or, 8 homes on a parcel that doesn't pencil out without the rounding factor. So I would maybe propose doing away with the rounding at all for short plats, and then for the rounding in the long plats is to create that additional unit to be a duplex, because a duplex looks very similar to a single family home, but it does provide then 2 units of far more affordable housing than another single family house would. And I think that helps to achieve some of the goals that this council is trying to get. And I granted, 2 duplexes isn't going to solve the affordable housing issue, but it's certainly a step in the right direction, because if we're going to allow for an additional unit, why have that be a $1.6 million house when it could be 2 $600,000 duplexes?
That was a lot.
Sorry. It was a lot of thinking today, too. Sorry. I guess the question is do we want to allow staff to explore what that code language would look like in order to have the rounding produce a duplex instead of another single-family home?
No, and actually, your point is very well taken on that. Okay, so one, I'm going to have staff, if you can respond to Mayor Melcho, and then I'll tell you the queue lineup.
Well, I'll leave the color commentary to David, but in terms of in terms of the actual doing the actual code amendment proposal for this, based on what the mayor is offering you as a council, it's a fairly straightforward code amendment. It's going to take about 5 minutes to do. So,
Can you summarize what you think that code amendment looks like, just because that was a long explanation from the mayor?
that's the color commentary.
Okay, thank you.
That would be rewriting that section with rounding. It's a subsection. And what it would be is there would be no rounding for short plats. Short plats would not be eligible to round, so you'd have to have a whole number. So say you were at 3.85, that would be 3 units. If you were at 3.99, that'd be 3 units. If you were at 4.01, that'd be 4 units. So that's an important distinction, because it's the bar you're sliding. The Planning Commission discussed this at length. This is one of the items that they did take up and debate at length. And they, I think, we're trying to land in the same place that Mayor Malcho is trying to land in with regard to the affordable units being tacked on. But they did hear some testimony from members of the public, master builders, others that really the market, they're trying to build to what the market wants to buy. So what ends up happening is that if you're forcing them to build a duplex by, through the calculation, that it might, the trim levels on a duplex might push it into a different level where it's not really affordable anymore, higher end duplex, that type of stuff, because they're still going to go for that price point in the market, because it's a business at the end of the day. That's where they make their money. So that said, it's a pretty simple code fix to change from the current draft. All we would do is we basically would push up what is down lower in D, push that up higher into the section around plats. So for those projects that achieve 9 units before rounding, you would round up at whatever the number you set it at. I think currently it's at 0.51. And that then any additional units achieved, the additional unit achieved must be built through the form of a duplex or a townhouse. So you'd have a 2 units in one, and it would look like a single family home, as Mayor Malchow points out. We have some design requirements for duplexes and townhomes. So what you would end up seeing is you wouldn't notice it necessarily in the neighborhood because it would be blended in. And there would be 2 units in that building, and then those 2 units would be marketed as a duplex or a condo style unit.
Okay, in the queue, we have got Councilmember Valderrama, followed by Councilmember Ritchie.
Thank you. I just want to ask staff, so you're prepared to bring back an alternative also to look at this, is that correct?
An alternative, I think he said.
We are prepared to bring back language based on whatever what the council directs us to. We'll bring back one proposed alternative. We're not going to draft multiple alternatives at this point for this one.
Okay.
Exactly. Okay, thank you.
Okay, and then it is actually Councilmember Stewart.
Oh. Okay. Just to expand, so you said that there was lengthy discussion on this, and again, I'm not opposed to it, I'm just trying to understand. So there was lengthy discussion on the rounding already. So is there, other than us going back, and we can always go watch the meeting, and maybe we could get which meeting it was from you where we could watch that, or if there's a summary of kind of where that landed, just because if that was something that was discussed at great length, before we make a change to that, I want to make sure we have all of that input there. The other question I have is, because of net density and some of our other restrictions, with the rounding, would there ever be an instance, or could there ever be an instance where the rounding could yield more housing than the zoning? So for example, that it could yield 5 houses in R4, which the mayor alluded to.
Yes.
There it is.
Under the current method we've been using.
No, but I'm saying with what we're proposing in the permanent, the regulations as they're drafted now. Let's put it that way. With the 0.71 instead of 0.51.
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's fair. Hey, let me put you on the spot some more. Okay, so I like the idea of the affordability. I'm not sure that I like the idea of saying it must be a townhouse or a duplex, just because if I think about consistency and character, if I have a short plat, so I've got 7 houses and then I put a duplex or a townhouse just in there. So I think I'd like to, again, not box us in too much, but if we could define affordability that says the only way you could get some additional rounding is if you allocated a certain number of the units to be affordable. Because don't we already have definitions for affordable without forcing it to be a duplex or a townhouse, and allow whoever's developing it to determine that on their own?
I believe we do. I'd have to look at the code again. It's something we don't receive many requests for, is the construction of affordable housing. So I have not really worked in that section regularly, and my familiarity with the code comes from those sections that I apply regularly to projects.
Sure. So I guess my request would be, if we're looking at alternatives, that we, again, be consistent in the code and our definitions, and as opposed to being prescriptive or more prescriptive than what we already have, but to define it as, affordable. I know that we have like affordable housing bonuses for like the town center, and to understand what that code looks like, and again, to try to be consistent there and allow the flexibility given the circumstance, right? That whatever the lot, whether long plat, short plat, whatever it is, that we get that benefit of the affordable housing, which I love, without having to go down some path that, again, may yield unintended consequences.
So an affordable duplex unit is treated as, so an affordable unit in the code under the density calculation and how you apply density is treated as a half of a unit. So if you were to build an affordable duplex unit, you could effectively build 4 of those in the place of, so say you were at 10.52, and you're building 10, you would build 9 market units, and you could then build 2 non-market duplex, 2 units in a duplex that are that are market, or you could build 4 affordable duplex units. So you would go from 9 to 11 at the market rate under that scenario. If you were at, I'm trying to do the math in my head, if you were at 10.51, you would be able to build 9 single family homes and 1 duplex, which would be 2 units, or 9 single family homes and 4 affordable units in 2 duplex buildings, is what the code would allow under this scenario that we're talking about.
And when you say this scenario, you mean what the mayor described or what I'm asking for to not?
Both.
Both, okay.
Yeah.
So what the mayor, I think the mayor was describing, you'd go from 9 to 11 with a 10.52 in David's example. What you're putting forward, Councilmember Stewart, is 9 to 13 because of the additional density bonus you get with the affordable, right?
Because, well, yes, because I think what I heard you say, David, is that if we just let it be duplex, it may not, in fact, be affordable at all. So if our goal here is to allow the rounding because we're trying to encourage affordability, then we need to define those homes as affordable, which I believe come with additional restrictions in terms of what they would be sold for. Isn't that correct?
So under that scenario, yes, and I don't want to speak for the mayor, but I think the mayor's analogy was taking a $1.6 million, whatever the number was, detached single-family home and creating 2 duplex units for some price point lower than 1.6 million. I'm not sure the exact number she gave in her example, but the relative comparison is taking a market rate duplex unit and saying that's more affordable than the $1.6 million detached single family home, or taking an 80% AMI unit and having it managed through Arch. That would be some number less than that, obviously, the market rate duplex.
And one of the conversations the Planning Commission had about the housing strategy was that we sort of lost in the middle, right? We could target affordable housing, we could target market housing, but there's this diversity of choices of housing that are lost. So what we've been trying to do is, like, how do we promote, incentivize so that the builders are still wanting to build these units. And this is one way to get there. The code already allows for you to double the density if you're building affordable units. So the builder that under that would have an option if they had 10.51 was their calculation, and they built 9 market homes, and then they built 2 market duplex units, then they could do that. Or they would have the option to amplify that, and they could build 4 affordable duplex units. The way the code works, the way we already have that built into the code with regard to how affordable units are treated for density. So what that would do is that would build on what we're talking about here tonight.
So I guess, as with all the other things, I'm certainly open to having staff be able to come back with an alternative for us, just, with all the other ones. I guess my additional request on here would be, could you actually write down some of these scenarios for us? Because I followed most of it, but I think I need to be able to kind of see the math in writing, or maybe that's something I could just schedule time with you to understand the different scenarios between what the code already says based on how it is versus how it would be different. I think that would be helpful for when we have to determine which alternative we'd want. And I don't know if that's asking too much, but that was a lot of math that we just went through, and I'm a kind of a visual person, so I like to see the math written down.
If we're going to take away rounding from all short plats, what does that do?
Yeah, kind of understanding those pros and cons. So again, I'm supportive of if staff feels that they can handle it to see those alternatives, or that one alternative, sorry.
Okay, so
Oh, excuse me, Deputy Mayor, just a quick comment on that.
Okay.
So I think seeing it in code on the screen on Tuesday will help everybody process some of that, and then we can certainly bring some additional supporting information.
Thank you.
To the extent we need to.
I do believe our city manager has got something to say. Please say that.
I'm looking at your long-range calendar and looking at this discussion tonight, and we talked about 3 items, and you're running close to 3 hours already. You have Balmora on your agenda for Tuesday night, and you also need to make a selection on city manager. Once again, we're working an issue at the council dais. This is a work session issue until you're comfortable enough to vote on it. So I'll be talking about staff about moving this back to another agenda at some point, probably a study session.
That's a good idea.
Excellent, thank you. And Christy, I believe you wanted to have, or Mayor Melchior, you had one more comment?
Yeah, I think just to clarify, because it's a very different scenario when we're talking about rounding from the scenario David Davis, which was 10.52, and you have 9 market units, which are single family homes, and your bonus is a duplex, which essentially creates 2 homes in 1 unit. Deeming them actually affordable units, and I'm not opposed to that, but we are talking about a severe increase at that point towards what that density looks like in that neighborhood to do 4 units in there. I think where my mind was at when I originally came in here, and maybe we need to massage this a little bit as the city manager suggested, but if we are going to give a credit, which is essentially how I look at the rounding, to the development community to build another unit, the unit that they're going to build with the rounding is going to be a single family house unless we are able to use that bonus that they're getting and dictate what it is they can build. And we can say, okay, you can build another, $1.6 million house that's, 4,400 square feet or whatever it is, or you can build a duplex, and maybe those duplexes are $600,000 each. And I understand that, $600,000 isn't necessarily affordable, but it is far more affordable than the $1.6 million house that they will build if we don't tell them that your credit is going to get you this. So I think that's where my head was at, that I'm not opposed to the rounding if the rounding is going to yield something that this community needs. And it's not another $1.6 million single family house. It's something different.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we have a motion and a second for moving this forward, I believe.
Did we already do that? Okay, good. Oh, there was no second.
Second.
There was no second?
Okay, do you want to try again? I move that we move forward with number 10 as written and ask staff to come back with options.
An option.
As written or as I
No,
said?
whatever they're going to come back with an alternative. Right?
But what's written is not what I just said, just for clarification. Totally different. That's why I wanted to pull it out.
You wanted to pull it out?
I pulled it out because what I just told you and proposed is not what is written. What is written there is specific to townhomes. There is a carve out if you actually look at the language in the code, it says letter D for subdivision proposals with density calculations resulting in fractions, and where the project design utilizes townhomes or duplexes for at least 25% of the total project units, the fraction shall be rounded to the nearest whole number as follows. Fractions of 0.21 or above shall be rounded up. Fractions of 0.20 will be rounded down. So my original question for staff and what ended up in this matrix was relative to that specifically. And what I described was later in my thoughts and discussions with staff after they put this matrix together was, hey, what if the requirement for producing that credit that they would get for the leftover, if you will, after doing the density calculations was required to be not as another single family house, but it's required to be a duplex, because that produces 2 units, not 1, 2, but they are far more affordable than the single unit. And maybe the development community will decide we don't want to. And in that case, they would just build what they would otherwise have without rounding in place. But if they want to round and they want to take advantage of the rounding, then they will need to produce a duplex.
Okay.
So that's totally different from what's there, just for clarification.
Then I would ask, I'd like to make a motion that staff work with Mayor Malchow to clarify that issue, because there's a lot of information there, and given the time, I'd ask that the staff work with Council or Mayor Malchow to try to clarify that and to provide us with some further research and information in written form as soon as possible.
Second.
I'll second that.
Okay, we have a first and a second. Could there possibly be any more discussion?
Oh, God, no.
I don't think so. I'm going to call for the question. All in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? All right. Okay. All right, moving on. Well done, guys. Next steps.
Really?
Really?
You got more?
Only going to depend on the interim city manager's discussion in his office after this meeting. Yeah. So I guess we'll let you know. How's that?
Fair. That is completely fair.
Let us know how that turns out.
I think we all saw, just from this last bit of discussion, that you still have a lot of learning that you want to do on this, and that is a study session topic as opposed to bringing it to you for action. And particularly on that you've got to make a tough decision on a couple of issues and then try to select a city manager. I wouldn't want to be my head on the chopping block that night. So.
Okay, moving on with our agenda. So we got a shot of getting out of here in time. We've got council reports. Let's start down with Council Member Stewart.
So I don't have a written report, but I spent last Friday over at the Habitat for Humanity with the International Women Build Day. It was a fabulous event. Our partners over there are doing a great job. I got to hang out with one of the families. They came and put in their sweat equity. The folks from Lowe's, they actually had more volunteers than were allowed to be on site. So they had to limit the number of people who showed up. So it was just a really fabulous event. There will be other opportunities for the community to come and volunteer. So I would encourage folks to come out and volunteer. It's just a really rewarding experience. It's a lovely community in there, and I'm really excited for that. So I really, it was cold. It actually snowed in the morning. It rained most of the day, and I had a great time. So it was really wonderful. Thanks.
Councilmember Ritchie.
Thank you. I don't have a report, but I would like to make a motion that that council directs staff to provide us with at least every meeting, if not more frequently, but at least every general council meeting, an update on the latest information on where we are with the town center development.
I'll second that.
May I speak?
Second for discussion.
We have discussion.
Okay, we've got a motion on the floor and a second. And I'm going to let Councilmember Ritchie speak to the motion.
Thanks. So I think there is a lot of information going on behind the scenes and a lot of hard work going on by the staff. And I think we need, as a council, need to be more fully informed of those things on a more regular basis. It's not that anything's being hidden or any decisions are being made behind the scenes. I'm not making that statement at all. I am saying that as these negotiations go on, what can be discussed with council should be discussed more fully, more frequently, in as much as we can. Not key negotiation points or anything like that, but just where are we? What's the status? What's upcoming? How does it look? What is on the council's radar so that when these things do come up, we are more well-informed going forward. So that's the purpose behind the motion, is just to give us more information on a more regular basis.
Okay, that opens it for discussion. I'm going to make a comment before I don't see any problem. I don't want to have to necessarily have a report, a long written report or anything, a check-in, and that might be simply from the city manager. I don't know who's meeting or doing any talking or anything else, and maybe it falls under the manager report. That would simply fall right in there, but an update at meetings I guess that would work fine with me. I don't know if anybody else has any other discussion they'd like to add. I do see, hang on, in the queue we've got, okay, so we've got Councilmember Stewart, and then we've got, did I hear Mayor Malchow?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, okay, we're lighting up. All right, we're going to start off here with Councilmember Stewart.
Mine is very brief. I would propose an amendment that we allow the city manager to let us know what the appropriate frequency would be for that. I agree that it should be in a city manager report and to define that frequency for us, but I support the motion in principle.
Second, I'll second that amendment. That was my comment.
Okay. Oh, that was a comment. Okay. That was, Romero, was that your comment as well?
That was my comment as well.
All righty.
All right. So we need to vote on the amendment.
Well, there we go. So do we have any other discussion?
Yes.
Was
that
that
a yes?
Yes or a no?
Yeah, that's a me, yes.
Oh, okay. All right. So Councilmember Hornish.
I'll be quick. I think it's indicative of who we are as a council, trying to micromanage. That's an administrative effort. Discussions. I don't want to know all the negotiations. I don't know what I don't want to be involved with the back and forth. I don't want to think something's going forward and then something shifts. I want to make policy decisions, and I think this takes us way out of policy, like I said on Tuesday night.
Interesting.
Karen, can I make another comment?
Okay, Mayor Malchow.
Councilmember Hornish's point is very well taken. Although I do think there are opportunities for information just so that we are abreast of what's going on, which is important because there are still policy-related decisions going on within the town center, including regional stormwater. So I think maybe I should have spoken up when I had the opportunity relative to, I don't think I want to get a briefing every single meeting, but when there's something pertinent for council that staff thinks that we should be clued in on, I think that's when it's appropriate to get an update.
Okay, I would agree with that. Is there any other discussion? All right. Seeing no discussion. All in favor?
Wait, we got
On the amendment, right?
first.
We have
the amendment.
Okay, first we're going to vote on the amendment.
So the amendment is what?
The amendment was that we allow the city manager to define the appropriate cadence, or frequency of when an update, but that it becomes something that we hear from in the city manager report.
So it's his discretion? Is that what the amendment is?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, say nay.
Nay.
Okay, so we have one nay? All right, one nay, so we have a 6-1. Then we go back to the original. Please state the original.
So the motion as amended is that we will have, at the city manager's discretion, a report on status updates, not negotiation, of the town center as the city manager sees fit.
Perfect.
Does that need to be seconded again, Lydia? The original motion was seconded.
No.
I think it's good.
Yeah,
All right. All those in favor, say aye.
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 Okay, opposed, say nay. 7-0. All right. Are you done with your report? Yeah, I'll be done with this week, thanks. Fabulous. All right. I had I've just got some things real short. I had a meeting, EF&R meeting today. There seemed to be some confusion that was going on between some costs that might be coming to the city of Sammamish regarding the costs of the upcoming vote that would be taking place with Fall City. And so I will be working with the city manager to try to get that all straightened out and get some good information out to the public, because there seems to be a misunderstanding of what the costs are between a partnership and a merger. Old costs that were talked about 5 or 7 years ago were going to cost the city dollars. But that was a partnership. This is a merger, and that is not going to cost the city any money. So we want to make sure that we have gotten rid of any possible lingering of any thoughts that are out there like that, and clean that up. And so I'll work with the city manager to make sure we do something on that. And Christy, I'll work with you on something on that as well. And then we've got Councilmember Ross, and then up in the clouds, do any of you have a council report?
I do.
So I do, but I didn't provide a written one because this was a special meeting and I was going to do it for next week, but I can certainly report out.
Okay, I will call on Councilmember Valderrama after Councilmember Ross.
Okay, I also sat in the Eastside Fire meeting today, board meeting. I just wanted to add one thing that was kind of cool that will be more promoted. It's called Community Connect. And it's basically a software interface, web-based, where you input all of your house type parameters, who's in your house. If you have someone who has mobility problems, what are your pets? You got someone with or maybe hiding. It helps the fire department and first responders to know exactly what to look for, and has a real good blueprint of what's in the contents of a home. And there's only 1 or 2 departments nationwide that are utilizing this right now. And Eastside Fire is going to be first in King County. So this is a pretty big deal that we'll hear much more about, but it's a very cool, very secure, and it could save lives.
Yeah, we're hoping to get them to come to the city council and give us a, well, we won't have time in a meeting, but maybe at a workshop, give us the lowdown on it. Okay, Councilmember Valderrama.
Yes, I'm at the National League of Cities in Washington, D.C., where we've been meeting with the executive branch and the legislative branch. The emphasis this year is infrastructure, and at all levels, the pressure is on housing and affordable housing. And new regulations to try to encourage that is the big thing, because we have the same election going on right now. So that was some really good discussions at all levels here. Additionally, behind that was the opioid crisis continues. On the Eastside Fire and Rescue, I just wanted to add 1.5 years ago, Sammamish with Don Jaron on the Technical Services Committee had recommended that Fall City be brought on as a member of Eastside Fire, whether through merger or at that time actually even as a partnership. So the old outdated information is way back, because even as of 5 years ago, the Technical Services Committee was asking to look into that, and Sammamish was behind and actually pushing that. Thank you.
Okay, so moving on for city manager report. All right.
Move to adjourn.
Move to adjourn?
Second.
All right, second. We are adjourned.
No, we have to vote.
Oh, wait. Okay, all in favor?
Nay.